She was lying on the floor beneath a murderer's desk, one hand pressed over her mouth, his confession folded against her heart, while the man who had ordered her killed stood 18 inches away discussing the timing of it. She had arrived in this town 3 weeks ago with 11 cents and a forged letter. She was not leaving without the truth. This is the story of how she got it. She was not supposed to be here. That was the thought that moved through Lily Rose Brennan like cold water through cracked stone as she stood in the absolute darkness of the Aurora mine, her fingers trembling around a small brass locket that had no business existing in this place, at this hour in her hands. The lantern Jonah held cast a circle of amber light no wider than a prayer. Beyond its reach, the mountain pressed in from every direction. Water dripped somewhere deep in the rock, slow and patient, the way guilt drips through a man's conscience, for 30 years without ever stopping. She opened the locket. The photograph inside had faded the way all photographs from that era faded, edges softening into gray, the contrast bleeding away like color from a late autumn sky. But the face remained. Young, perhaps 25, strong cheekbones, a particular set to the jaw, eyes that held something between determination and sorrow. She knew that face. She had seen it every morning for 24 years, whenever she looked into a mirror. Jonah's voice came from somewhere behind her left shoulder, low and careful, the way a man speaks when he understands that the wrong word at the wrong moment can shatter something irreplaceable. Lily. She could not answer him. Not yet. Around the skeleton's neck, that brass locket had waited in the dry, cold darkness of the mine for longer than she had been alive. Scattered near the bones were papers remarkable only in that they had survived at all, preserved by the same airless chill that had preserved everything else down here. Letters, notes, the careful handwriting of a man who had understood, perhaps in his final hours, that he was not going to make it out. Her fingers found the largest sheet. She tilted it toward the lantern. The handwriting was her father's. She knew it from the margins of the formula drawings she had taken from Pike's filing cabinet, the same fluid, hurried hand she had recognized without being able to name. She knew it now. She knew it as well as she knew her own. The date at the top read September 15th, 1858. She had not yet been born. The man she had called father for 24 years had died in this mountain on that date. He had died knowing what Gerald Pike had done. He had died unable to stop it. And somewhere back east, in a city she had fled, believing she was escaping her past, another man had picked up her father's name and his life and his unfinished story and carried them forward into a world that never thought to question. Her father had been here all along. Jonah's hand found her shoulder, warm through the fabric of her dress, solid in the way that only a man who works with his hands understands, the kind of steadiness that does not come from words or intentions, but from years of learning how to hold heavy things without letting them fall. Outside the mine, somewhere on the mountain trail below, she could hear the distant percussion of hoofbeats. 5 riders, the men Vincent Kane had sent to make sure she never reached Denver, never reached the United States Marshal's office, never laid Pike's handwritten confession on a lawman's desk, and watched 30 years of carefully maintained power begin to crumble. Hours. That was all they had before Kane discovered what she had taken from Pike's office. Hours before the warrant reached a sheriff he had purchased like a piece of furniture. Hours to put enough mountain between themselves and the men Kane would send between them, and men who wanted them dead riding hard from behind. She folded her father's letter with the same care she would have used on something sacred, because it was, and placed it inside her dress alongside Pike's journal pages and the complete varnish formula, all of it pressed against her heart, where no one could take it without going through her first. She stood. She turned toward the deeper dark of the passage that would bring them out the other side of the mountain toward Denver, toward justice, toward whatever came next. "Let's go," she said. But to understand how a woman who arrived in Silverwood, Colorado with 11 cents in her pocket and a forged letter in her hand ended up standing over the bones of her real father in the belly of a mountain, while the most powerful men in the territory rode hard to stop her, we need to go back 3 weeks. We need to go back to the day the stagecoach stopped. This is the story of a woman who was sold by a stepfather who valued her only as a debt payment, who crossed half a continent with nothing but a forged name, and the particular stubbornness of a woman who has run out of other options, and who arrived in a Colorado mountain town with nothing but 11 cents a carpenter's tool roll, and the kind of stubbornness that poverty either kills or hardens into something unbreakable. In the next 2 hours, you will watch her discover that the man she called father was not her father at all. You will watch her break into a councilman's private office while the men who murdered her real father discussed her disappearance from the floor above. You will watch her hold on to the edge of a cliff over a 1,000-foot drop with nothing but raw will, keeping her fingers locked on stone. And you will watch her walk into the United States Marshal's office in Denver with a dead man's confession in her hand, stand in front of a federal lawman, and say quietly and without any drama at all exactly what she had come to say. She had 11 cents when she arrived. What she built from that starting point and what it cost her to build it is what this story is about. The clock was already running. Hours before Vincent Kane discovered the missing journal. Hours before the warrant reached a sheriff he had purchased like a piece of furniture. Days to ride through the Rockies in early autumn while men with rifles and nothing to lose came up behind. She was already late. The stagecoach from Denver hit Silverwood at 3 in the afternoon on the 14th of September, 1887, and Lily Rose Brennan stepped down into the Colorado dust, wearing a navy wool dress that had once been fine and was now 3 years and 1,000 sorrows past fine, with blood dried at the corner of her mouth and 11 cents in the bottom of her carpet bag, and the bone-deep exhaustion of a woman who had not slept properly in a week. She was 24 years old. She had green eyes, the color of creek water, in late spring, dark brown hair she kept braided for travel because loose hair collected trouble, the way loose money collected bad decisions, and a split lower lip from the second night out of Philadelphia when the driver had decided that a woman traveling alone was an invitation he had not been asked to decline. He had been wrong about that. She had her father's carpentry all. Not the man who raised her, not the stranger she had called father for 24 years without knowing he was a stranger, but the man who had given her the tool before she understood what it was worth, before she understood that sometimes the most valuable thing a parent can pass down is not love or money or a name, but the simple knowledge of how to make something useful out of raw material. The all had drawn blood. The driver's eyes had promised consequences. 3 days of rattling mountain roads had passed without those consequences. Arriving, which meant either that the driver was reconsidering or that he was patient, and patience in a man like that was worse than rage. She had not looked back when she stepped off the coach. She was looking forward now at a town that spread before her with the specific kind of promise that Western mountain settlements carried in that era, the promise of a clean start in a place that had not yet cataloged your failures, that did not know your stepfather's name, or the condition of your winter coat, or the fact that you had pawned your mother's wedding ring to pay for a ticket to a place you had never been to, marry a man you had never met. The letter was in her coat pocket. She had read it so many times that the folds had gone soft, the paper nearly transparent at the creases. Miss Brennan, I am Jonah Stone Carpenter and mill owner in Silverwood, Colorado territory. I require a wife to manage my household and help raise my young nephew. I can offer respectability, steady income, and a future. If you are of good character and willing to work, I believe we could make a fair arrangement. Arrive before month's end. No poetry, no declaration. No promises of love or happiness, or any of the ornate nonsense that filled the mail-order bride advertisements she had seen posted in the windows of the agency on Chestnut Street. Just an honest transaction, plainly stated, which was she had decided more valuable than poetry. She had grown up in a world of men who made beautiful promises and delivered something altogether different. She preferred a man who told you what he had to offer and let you make your own determination. She smoothed the front of her dress, lifted her carpet bag, and started walking toward the east end of town. Silverwood in September was a town still deciding what it wanted to be. The lumber trade had built it, silver had briefly inflated it, and now it was settling into the particular dignity of a place that had survived its own boom without being destroyed by it. Wooden buildings lined the main street with the false fronts that were standard in that era, presenting facades of greater permanence than the structures behind them actually possessed, which Lily thought was more honest than it appeared, since every person she had ever met was doing the same thing. She passed the general store where a man in a canvas apron was setting out a display of winter goods that would not be needed for another 6 weeks, but the appearance of preparation was its own kind of commerce. She passed a boarding house 3 stories of whitewashed pine with a sign reading Murphy's Rooms, where a gray-haired woman sweeping the porch looked up and gave Lily the kind of assessing look that takes in everything important in under 3 seconds and files it away for future reference. Their eyes held for a moment. The woman nodded once. Lily nodded back and kept walking. She passed a blacksmith's forge, a stable yard, a building that smelled of coffee and sawdust that might have been a feed store or a saloon or both. And then she was at the east end of town, where the street gave way to forest, and the Rockies rose in the distance like a different kind of promise entirely, and there was stonewood carpentry. It was larger than she had expected. She did not know why she had expected something small. The letter had said mill owner, which was not the language of a man with a backwoods shed and 3 tools. But there was a difference between understanding something intellectually and standing in front of the reality of it. And the reality of stonewood carpentry was a 2-story workshop with wide double doors standing open to the afternoon air, lumber stacked in the yard with the kind of precision that spoke of a mind that found disorder genuinely offensive, and from inside the steady rhythmic sound of a hand plane working with the woods grain, not against it. Her father had made that sound. The man she had called her father. She pushed that thought aside. This was not the moment for complicated things. She stepped through the double doors into a space that smelled of pine sap and linseed oil and the particular mineral sweetness of fresh-cut hardwood, and she stopped. The workshop was cathedral in scale ceiling high enough that the sawdust floating in the afternoon light moved like snow in no wind at all. Workbenches lined 3 walls covered with tools arranged with the same meticulous logic as the lumberyard outside. Along the far wall, half-finished projects waited in various stages of becoming. A staircase railing carved with oak leaves whose detail was fine enough to suggest individual veins. A cabinet with doors that would fit together when closed like 2 hands finding each other. A rocking chair whose curved runners had been shaped from a single piece of bent alloy, the grain following the curve as though the wood itself had chosen that form. She had grown up around good craftsmanship. She knew what she was looking at. This was exceptional work. The man at the far bench had not heard her enter, or if he had decided that what he was doing required completion before it required interruption. He was working a longboard with a jack, plain, both hands steady on the tool weight, shifting forward with each stroke, the wood curling away in thin ribbons that fell to the floor and caught the light. Tall, broad across the shoulders in the particular way of men who have used their bodies as their primary instrument for a decade or more. Dark hair with gray, beginning at the temples. Work pants and a shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, forearms marked with the small, parallel scars that every carpenter accumulates like a kind of professional autobiography. He was perhaps 30, perhaps slightly older. The kind of face that had been through something significant and come out the other side, still intact but permanently changed. Angular in structure, weathered in surface, the kind of face that in better circumstances might have been described as handsome, but in its current configuration was simply serious in a way that suggested seriousness was not a mood, but a permanent condition. She cleared her throat. The planing stopped. He set down the tool with the care of a man who respects his instruments, smoothed his hands once along the wood surface, then turned. His eyes were gray, the color of weathered granite or of sky, just before a storm system closes in, or of early morning on water. They swept across her with the same professional assessment she had seen him apply to the board he had been planning, taking inventory of what was there and making rapid determinations about what it meant. The split lip, the travel-worn dress, the carpet bag held in both hands with the particular grip of someone who has learned that everything they own fits inside one container and they do not intend to put it down. She drew herself straight. "I'm Lily 100. She drew herself straight. "I'm Lily Brennan," she said, "from Philadelphia. I received your letter." The silence that followed lasted long enough that she had time to notice 3 things. The way his jaw tightened slightly, the way his hands hanging at his sides curled once and then deliberately opened again, and the smell of the workshop deeper while steeped in oil, and something older underneath the smell of wood that has been worked for years in the same space, a smell that accumulates and becomes its own kind of record. "I didn't send any letter." 5 words. She had come 2,000 miles. She had spent everything she had. She had left behind the only city she had ever known, her sister's grave in the potter's field, the house where she had been born, and the stepfather who had sold her absence for $80 to clear a gambling debt. She had survived 3 days of mountain roads and a driver whose intentions she had needed an all to clarify. And the man she had come to marry was telling her with 5 flat words and a closed face that none of it had been real. "I don't understand," she said. Her voice came out smaller than she had intended. He crossed the workshop toward her. Not quickly, not with particular urgency, but with the deliberate movement of a man who has decided something and is carrying it out. He held out his hand for the letter. She gave it to him. He read it standing in the light from the open doors, and she watched his face the way she had learned to watch faces, the way you learn to read wood grain for hidden tension that will express itself later if you ignore it now. She saw his jaw tighten further, saw something move beneath the surface of that controlled expression, something hot and then quickly suppressed. This isn't my handwriting. He gave the letter back to her. Someone is playing a game, and you got caught in it. I'm sorry you traveled this far, Miss Brennan. But I didn't send for a mail-order bride. I won't be taking one. She heard the finality in his voice the way you hear a nail driving home with a final blow. Not angry, not cruel, simply finished. Please, she hated the word. She had grown up understanding that begging was a currency you spent only when you had nothing else left, and she had nothing else left. I can work, I'm strong, I can cook clean whatever your household needs. I don't need much, I don't need anything. Behind him from somewhere deeper in the workshop, a voice called out. A child's voice still high with youth, but carrying the particular directness that children have before they learn that honesty sometimes costs more than it returns. Uncle Jonah, who is that? A boy appeared from behind a timber stack on the right side of the workshop. 10 years old, perhaps, 11, built entirely of elbows and untidy optimism, dark hair like his uncle's, but eyes that carried something lighter and more open eyes that had not yet learned to keep the world at a distance. He was looking at Lily with the uncomplicated curiosity of a child who has not yet been taught that staring is impolite. Nobody, Tommy. The man's voice shifted when he spoke to the boy. A fraction of warmth entered it, involuntary, the way heat enters a cold room when someone opens a door to the outside without intending to. Go back to your sanding. But Tommy did not go back to his sanding. He moved closer to Lily, looking up at her with an expression that was not quite concern, but was adjacent to it, and said in the same direct tone he might have used to ask the time, "Did someone hurt you?" He was looking at her lip. In the workshop, the only sound was the slow drift of sawdust in the afternoon light. Jonah Stone's hands hanging at his sides curved into fists, then opened again. He turned to the boy with a look on his face that was trying to be stern and was not quite succeeding. Inside Tommy, now. The boy went, but his question stayed behind him in the air of the workshop the way smoke stays in a room after the source has been removed. Jonah Stone looked at Lily's split lip. Something moved across his face. Not quite the careful neutrality he had maintained since she walked through his doors. Something older and rawer and more complicated. I'm sorry you were deceived, he said. And she heard in his voice that he meant it, that whatever he was and whatever walls he had built around himself, he was not a man who was comfortable with the idea of a woman standing in his workshop at the end of a 2,000-mile lie with a split lip and 11 cents. I can't help you. I won't be responsible for another person's welfare. I learned that lesson once, and I won't learn it again. There was pain in that sentence. The specific practiced pain of something that has been carried for long enough that the carrier has made a kind of peace with it. Not healed, just accommodated. She recognized it. She wore the same kind of pain in the same way. Can you at least tell me who might have sent that letter? She asked. Who would pretend to be you? His jaw worked for a moment. Vincent Kane, he said, owns the mill on the west side of town. Has a particular sense of humor. Why would he do this to you and to me? Because he wants my land and I won't sell it. And because embarrassing me is the next best option. He turned back to his workbench. The conversation was over in his posture before it was over in his words. I'm sorry, Miss Brennan. There's a boarding house in town, Murphy's Rooms. Try there. I told you I have 11 cents. Then you'll need to find work. She stood there for one more moment looking at the back of his head, at the careful set of his shoulders, at the hand that had already returned to the plane handle, as though she were already gone. She thought about what she wanted to say. She thought about what she could afford to say. She thought about her sister Clara's coat in her carpet bag still carrying the faint ghost of lavender from the sachet their mother had kept with it, and about the $8 she had not had, and about what $8 might have changed. She picked up her carpet bag. She walked back out into the Colorado sun. The mountains to the west were beginning to catch the first long gold of late afternoon, and the sky above them was the particular blue of high altitude, a color so clean it hurt something in the chest when you looked at it directly. She stood on the dirt street at the edge of Stonewood Carpentry's lumberyard and allowed herself exactly 3 seconds to feel the full weight of her situation. Then she started walking toward Murphy's rooms, because the only alternative was to stop walking, and she had not come this far to stop. Kate Murphy was not a woman who wasted words on people who had not yet demonstrated they were worth the investment. She was 55 years old, gray-haired, built for endurance rather than comfort, with hands that had done serious work for a long time and eyes that assessed people the way a good carpenter assesses a piece of lumber, looking not at the surface but at the grain beneath, looking for where the stress would express itself, looking for hidden flaws and unexpected strengths. She looked at Lily for perhaps 4 seconds. 11 cents won't buy you a night, she said, but I need help with supper service. You work tonight, clean up after you get a meal and a bed in the attic. Tomorrow we discuss something more permanent. I won't disappoint you. We'll see. Kate turned toward the interior of the boarding house with the particular efficiency of a woman who has much to do and limited patience for sentiment. Third door on the right upstairs. Put your bag down. Be in the kitchen in 20 minutes. And the work that followed was exactly what Lily needed, which was to say it was hard enough to make thinking impossible. She peeled potatoes until her palms ached, stirred pots of stew until the steam had put a particular curl into the loose strands of hair. Around her face carried plates and bread, and water pitchers to the dining room, where 12 boarders sat down at 6 o'clock with the single-minded efficiency of men who had been doing physical labor since before dawn and were not interested in anything except refueling. They barely looked at her. One of them did. He came in last, taking the corner table with the particular studied casualness of a man who has learned that choosing your own position in a room is itself a form of authority. 40, perhaps 42, with hair slicked back in a suit that was demonstrably too expensive for Silverwood, though Silverwood was the town he had apparently chosen to make his kingdom. His smile when he looked at Lily was the kind of smile that tells you everything you need to know about a man's view of the world and your place in it. Well, he said. His voice was smooth, educated, the voice of a man who had learned to use language the way some men use tools as an instrument of precise application. Kate's got new help. Kate appeared from the kitchen with the speed of a woman who has learned to stay close when certain people are in her dining room. Leave her alone, Kane. She's here to work. Kane. The name hit Lily like cold water. Vincent Kane, the man who had sent the letter. The man who had destroyed her last hope for sport, had spent her passage money and her last shred of dignity on a joke, had brought her 2,000 miles for his own amusement while she sat on a stagecoach clutching a lie and thinking about whether this would be the thing that saved her. She set the water pitcher down on the sideboard with a carefulness that was entirely an act of will. Kane's eyes found her face. Something in her expression gave her away, or perhaps nothing gave her away, and he simply saw the pieces arranging themselves into an obvious picture. You're Vincent Kane, she said. Quiet, level, the voice she used when she wanted to make sure a thing landed exactly where she threw it. The room went still. Every fork stopped moving. Kane raised his eyebrows with the theatrical surprise of a man who is never actually surprised. My reputation precedes me. You sent a letter to Philadelphia, using Jonah Stone's name, asking for a mail-order bride. Ah, he touched his napkin to the corner of his mouth. That, yes, I thought Jonah could use some excitement. Did you actually come all this way expecting to marry that? I spent everything I had on that ticket. Her voice did not rise. This was one of the things she had learned early, that a voice that does not rise when it has every reason to rise is more frightening than shouting. I have nowhere to go, no way home, because you thought it would be amusing. That is, Kane said with the particular tone of a man conceding a minor point in an argument he is not worried about losing unfortunate. Tell you what, since I'm feeling generous, I could use help at my mill. $5 a week, more than fair for a woman. And what would this help involve? Whatever I need. His smile widened, thinned, became something else. Cooking, cleaning, keeping me company when the evenings get long. The other boarders were looking at their plates, every one of them. the studied disengagement of men who have decided that what is happening is not their problem. Kate's hand had gone beneath her apron. "I'd rather starve," Lily said. Kane's expression shifted. The smoothness did not leave his face, but something colder moved beneath it, the way a current moves beneath the surface of water that appears still. He stood slowly, using his height, moving close enough that she could smell the pomade in his hair and the whiskey underneath it. "You're making enemies you can't afford in a town where I control a great deal of what's available to someone in your position. Then I'll be in good company." She held his gaze. "Because from what I understand, half this town already hates you. They're simply too practical to say it out loud." For a moment, she thought he might do something that could not be taken back. She saw his hand move. She saw the decision being made. Kate stepped between them. The pistol she had retrieved from beneath her apron was old but maintained with the care of a serious implement. "Out," she said. The single word carried all the weight of everything she had not said for the past several minutes. "You're not welcome in my house anymore, Kane." Kane looked at the gun, at Kate, at Lily. His smile came back slower and colder than before. "This isn't finished." He picked up his hat from the peg by the door with the deliberate movements of a man making a show of being unhurried. "Remember what I said, girl. Jobs are scarce. Winter's coming. You'll reconsider." The door closed behind him. The room exhaled. Kate tucked the pistol back beneath her apron with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a woman for whom this was not the first time. She looked at Lily with something that was not quite approval and not quite admiration, but carried traces of both. "That was stupid," she said. "I know. He'll make your life difficult." He already did. He made it difficult the moment he signed Jonah Stone's name to a letter and sent it to Philadelphia. Kate studied her for a moment longer. Then unexpectedly, something in her face relaxed. Not softened exactly, but became more itself, less armored. "I like you, Lily Brennan. You've got spine." She turned toward the kitchen. "Come on, we've got dishes to do and I've got things to tell you about this town." They worked side by side in the kitchen while the boarders finished their meals in the dining room and the Colorado night pressed against the windows cold and full of stars. Kate talked the way experienced people talk when they have information they have been carrying alone for too long and have finally found someone they believe might understand it. Vincent Kane had arrived in Silverwood 12 years earlier as a mill hand, smart and patient, and utterly without scruple, and had spent those 12 years building himself into the town's primary economic power through a combination of genuine business acumen and the kind of ruthlessness that functions best in places where the law is too thinly stretched to pay consistent attention. He now owned Kane Lumber, two supply businesses, a controlling interest in the assay office, and the professional loyalty of Sheriff Bodine, which he had purchased over several years of patient investment in the sheriff's personal and professional difficulties. Gerald Pike was older, 65, a founding presence in Silverwood, who served on the town council and was understood by the community to be a man of substance and judgment. He was Kane's senior partner in the lumber operation and had been Kane's original patron when the younger man was still finding his footing. Walter worked at Kane's mill, Kate said. Her hands had stilled in the wash water. She was looking at the window above the sink, at the darkness beyond it, in the way people look at darkness when what they are actually looking at is something inside themselves. "My son, good boy." He started asking questions about the timber Kane was using for a bridge contract over Silver Creek. Said the wood was graded wrong, that it wouldn't hold weight under a hard winter load. The water in the basin was not moving. "He had an accident," Kate said, "crushed by a falling log at the mill. Sheriff ruled it misfortune." "I know what it was." Lily set down the pot she had been drying. Outside, something moved in the dark, a horse shifting in the stable yard, 3 properties down, or a late walker on the boardwalk, or just the wind finding its way through the pine trees at the edge of town. "What about Jonah Stone?" she asked. "Where does he fit in all of this?" Kate picked up a dish. "Jonah's land backs onto Silver Creek. Only reliable water source on that side of town. Control that water and you control who can run what kind of operation up here. Kane's been trying to buy it for 3 years. Jonah won't sell." "What happened to his wife?" Kate was quiet for a moment. "Scarlet fever took them both, her and the little girl. He was in Denver buying specialty lumber for a church commission, the kind of contract that makes a business. By the time the telegram found him and he rode home, they were already buried. She set the dish on the drying rack. He's never forgiven himself for being gone. Lily thought about the way Jonah Stone had returned to his workbench while she was still standing in his workshop. The deliberate way he had picked up the plane as though the motion itself was a form of defense. The specific quality of his silence when Tommy had asked if someone had hurt her. She thought about grief that had been carried long enough to become structural load-bearing, the kind of grief that is no longer a feeling, but a fact of architecture. She thought, I know what that is. Why does Cain want Jonah's land badly enough to play tricks like that letter, she asked. Because Jonah refusing to sell is the only thing preventing Cain from having everything he wants on that side of town. And Cain does not tolerate the existence of things he wants that he does not have. Kate pulled the drain from the wash basin. The letter was meant to embarrass Jonah, put him off balance, make him look foolish to the community. Cain does this with men who refuse him. Small cruelties that accumulate. And I was the instrument of the small cruelty. You were whether anyone intended you to be or not. Lily looked at her hands in the dim kitchen light. The roughness on the palms from work, the faint stain on the right index finger where she had caught herself on a sharp edge of the carpentry awl after the incident with the stagecoach driver, the specific thinness that came from weeks of inadequate eating. She thought about the letter, the precision of the forgery, the careful choice of language that matched what a practical, no-nonsense craftsman might actually write. Whoever wrote that letter knew Jonah Stone's voice, she said slowly. The way he speaks, the way he thinks. They knew him well enough to approximate him convincingly. Kate looked at her. They also knew the mail-order bride agency in Philadelphia, the specific agency, the address, the forms required. Lily was thinking out loud now, the way she thought when she was measuring something working toward a conclusion from multiple reference points. That's not general knowledge, that's specific knowledge. The kind you'd have if you had done business with that agency before, or if you had researched it specifically for this purpose. Cain is thorough, Kate said. Whatever else he is, he doesn't do things carelessly. No. Lily picked up her carpet bag from the kitchen corner where she had set it before supper service. He doesn't. She climbed to the attic room, third door on the right, a narrow space with a sloped ceiling and a window that looked out over the main street. The bed was simple, the mattress honest, the blankets warm. She sat on the edge of the bed and took Clara's small coat from her carpet bag, the one that still carried the ghost of lavender, and held it in her lap. I don't know what I'm doing, she said to the empty room. To Clara, to whoever might be listening in the particular way that the dead sometimes seem to listen, when the living are honest enough about their condition to speak without audience in mind. But even as she said it, she was already looking at the letter again, holding it toward the small lamp on the bedside table, tilting it to the light. The paper. She had noticed something about the paper 3 days ago on the stagecoach and had filed it away in the part of her mind that keeps hold of things that don't quite fit the pattern until the pattern becomes clear enough to receive them. The paper had a faint watermark, just visible in a certain light. The kind of mark a stationery manufacturer pressed into paper to identify their product. She had seen that mark before, in Stonewood Carpentry's workshop, on the paper Jonah Stone kept on the small shelf above his primary workbench. She set the letter down. She sat with that knowledge for a moment, feeling the weight of what it meant. Cain had been inside Stonewood Carpentry. He had been close enough to the workbench to take paper from that shelf, which meant the letter was not simply a prank, but a piece of evidence, a demonstration of access and familiarity, and the particular contempt of a man who helps himself to what belongs to others, because he has decided at some fundamental level that the distinction between what is his and what belongs to other people is one that applies to lesser people than himself. She put the letter back into her carpet bag. She put Clara's coat gently on top of it. She lay down on the narrow bed in the attic of Murphy's rooms and looked at the ceiling, where the low lamplight made patterns that could have been anything. Outside, the mountains stood in the darkness, enormous and indifferent and very old. Something moved at the edge of the main street. She did not go to the window to look. She had seen enough for one day. Tomorrow there would be more. There was always more. She thought about Jonah Stone at his workbench, the careful way he had set down the plane before turning to face her, the way his hands had opened and closed when Tommy asked about her lip, the specific quality of the pain in his voice when he said he had learned his lesson about being responsible for another person's welfare. She thought about a man who made things of extraordinary quality in a workshop that smelled of pine and possibility, who was raising his dead brother's child with the stiff efficiency of a person who has learned to function inside grief, like a man learning to walk on a broken leg, getting the job done, getting from here to there, but not quite right, not quite fully present in the way that people are present when they still believe the future is real. She thought about what the future looked like from where she was standing, which was to say, not particularly hospitable with 11 cents and a split lip and no plan beyond the next 12 hours. And she thought about her father's carpentry tool roll in her bag, the chisels and planes that were worth more than gold to her precisely because they were his, because every edge and every handle had been shaped by his hands, because they were the most complete version of him she had carried from Philadelphia. The man who had given her those tools, the man she had called her father. She did not yet know, lying in that attic room on the first night she would spend in Silverwood, that those tools had not actually belonged to him. She did not yet know that the man who had taught her to read wood grain and cut dovetail joints and feel the difference between white oak and red oak with her eyes closed was himself a mystery, a gap in a story she had not yet been given access to, a placeholder for a man who had died in a mountain before she was born. She did not know any of that yet, but the knowledge was already in Silverwood, waiting for her in Tom Fletcher's memory, in Pike's locked journal, in the cold, dry dark of the Aurora mine. The knowledge had been waiting for 30 years for someone with the right bloodline and the right stubbornness to come and claim it. She closed her eyes. Somewhere outside, a wolf called from the high country, long and lonesome, the sound of wildness asserting itself against the edge of the civilized world the town was trying to build. She was still here, still breathing, still holding. That would have to be enough. For now, that would have to be enough. Act 2. 2. Building alliances in the first secret. Morning in Silverwood came with the particular clarity of high-altitude autumn, the kind of light that has traveled a long distance through thin air and arrives without compromise, illuminating everything it touches with a precision that flatter light from lower elevations does not achieve. Lily woke to the smell of coffee rising from Kate's kitchen and the sound of the main street beginning its daily business, horses and boot heels, and the distant ring of the blacksmith's hammer already working at something that required early attention. She lay still for a moment and then took inventory. 11 cents, 1 carpet bag, 2 dresses both mended, her father's tool roll, Clara's coat, the forged letter which was now also a piece of evidence she did not yet fully understand how to use, a split lip that had swollen slightly overnight and would look worse before it looked better, a job that paid in meals and a bed and the uncertain goodwill of a woman she had known for less than 24 hours, and a name, Vincent Kane. The man who had done this to her, who had thought her life was an appropriate instrument for a small cruelty aimed at someone else, who had dropped her into this situation, the way you drop a stone into water, carelessly interested only in the ripple, and not at all in what the stone's arrival meant to whatever lived in the depths below. She got up, braided her hair with the automatic efficiency of a woman who has learned to compress her morning routine into its essential operations, and went downstairs to the breakfast Kate had already set aside. Then Kate handed her a basket. "Deliveries," Kate said in the tone of a woman conveying a plan that has already been fully formed and does not require input. Mended linens for 3 businesses. Tom Fletcher's smithy at the end of Main Street, Doc Cross's office above the general store and the saloon. You'll meet people. They'll see you're capable. It might lead somewhere useful. She pressed something else into Lily's hand before she went. A small folding knife, the blade recently honed, the handle worn smooth with long use. "Just in case," Kate said in exactly the same tone she had used to describe the delivery route. Lily pocketed the knife without comment and went out into the morning. Tom Fletcher's smithy was a stone building at the far end of Main Street, the only stone building in a town that was otherwise entirely committed to wood, which said something about the blacksmith's relationship to permanence. The forge was already running when Lily arrived, the red glow of it visible from the doorway, and the old man at it was white-haired and bent in the shoulders with the particular curvature that comes from decades of leaning over work at waist height, but his arms were still thick with the muscle that serious smithing builds and maintains, and his strikes were unhurried and precise. He looked up when she entered. "Delivery from Kate Murphy," Lily said. "Mended linens." "Set them there." He nodded toward a clean bench near the wall and went back to his work. Lily set down the linens. She was turning to leave when something on the workbench along the right wall stopped her. A small chest, perhaps 14 inches long and 10 inches wide, sitting in the partial stage of completion. The metalwork was extraordinary small hinges and a lock plate decorated with scrollwork of the kind that takes patience and a particular quality of attention to produce. Delicate work, precise and confident. The work of a man who has spent a lifetime understanding what iron can be made to do. But the wooden panels were wrong. She could see it from across the room. The joints were rough, the fit imprecise, the grain orientation on two of the panels working against the natural movement of the wood rather than with it. In a dry climate, it might hold. In the humidity of a normal year, those panels would swell, and the joints would open, and eventually the chest would become an expensive piece of failed craftsmanship. The joints need rabbiting, she said. She said it before she had decided to say it, the words arriving from whatever part of her brain had been trained by years of watching her father work and listening to his explanations, and then doing the work herself under his patient instruction. Tom Fletcher set down his hammer. He turned and looked at her with full attention for the first time since she had come through his door. You know carpentry. My father was a carpenter. He taught me. Did he? This was not a question. It was the slow turning over of a piece of information, looking at it from multiple angles. Not many fathers teach their daughters that trade. Mine said good work doesn't care about the hands that make it. Something shifted in Tom Fletcher's expression. Not quite recognition and not quite surprise, but something that lived between them, a quality of attention that sharpened and focused, and became something more than the polite interest of an old man receiving a delivery from the boarding house. Your father sounds like a wise man, he said. He was, before he died and left me with very little. She heard the bitterness in her own voice and did not try to moderate it. She was too tired for performance this morning, too empty from the long weeks of traveling and fighting, and arriving at a lie to spend energy on the careful management of how she appeared. Tom picked up his hammer again, but he did not resume working. He held it loosely in one hand and looked at her with those eyes that had the particular quality of age, the quality of having seen enough. That very little surprises you, but almost everything still interests you. You think you could fix the wooden parts of that chest? I could try, but I don't have tools. I know someone who does. A pause. Someone who owes me a considerable favor and has the best workshop in Silverwood. I'll talk to him, see if he'll let you use his space for a few hours in exchange for some ironwork I can do that he's been putting off. Lily understood immediately who he meant. Jonah Stone won't want me in his workshop. Jonah's a stubborn man, but he's not cruel and he respects skill. Tom extended his free hand. Tom Fletcher. Been smithing here since before the paint dried on half these buildings. She shook the offered hand, feeling the grip of a man whose hands had been calibrated to iron for 50 years. Lily Brennan, I'm new here. Brennan. Something changed in Tom Fletcher's face. It was not a subtle change. The color shifted. His hand still holding her hand stilled. He looked at her with the intensity of a man who has just heard a sound in the dark that he recognizes but cannot immediately believe he is hearing. Brennan from where? Philadelphia. My father was Michael Brennan. He had a carpentry business there. The hammer in Tom Fletcher's left hand met the floor with a sound that rang through the smithy and settled into silence. His right hand, still holding hers, gripped with a sudden tightness that was entirely unconscious, the grip of a man reaching for something to hold on to. He looked at her face with an expression she had not seen on an adult since her mother died. The expression of someone encountering something they had believed was gone from the world permanently and therefore did not know how to process the fact of its return. Michael, he said. The name came out of him differently than she would have expected, not as identification, but as something closer to grief. Michael Brennan. You knew him. Knew him. He released her hand. He turned away from her, moving to a stool near the forge, lowering himself onto it with the careful movements of a man whose body requires negotiation. Girl, I worked with him before he went east, before he married and made a family. We were partners, him and me, and a man named Isaiah Stone. Lily Rose Brennan felt the floor of the world tilt under her feet. Isaiah Stone, Jonah Stone's father. She looked at the old man on the stool, at the way the forge light moved across his face, and showed her the young man. He had been inside the old man he was now. and she felt something she could only have described as the sensation of a key turning in a lock she had not known existed. This was not coincidence. This was the architecture of something larger, the structure of a story that had been building for 30 years, that had been waiting for the right person to arrive and see its shape clearly enough to walk the path it required. "What happened?" she asked. "Why did you separate?" Tom Fletcher looked at the fire in his forge for a long moment. When he turned back to her, his expression had settled into something that was simultaneously very old and very present. That he said is a long story, not one I should tell in a place where anyone walking by can hear. He glanced at the open doorway at the street beyond it, where Silverwood was going about its morning business, with no awareness that inside this smithy, something was happening that mattered considerably more than feed prices or lumber contracts. "You trust Kate Murphy?" "I think so. Yes." "Then finish your deliveries. Come back at sundown. I'll tell you everything." He paused. "Your father was the best carpenter I ever knew in 50 years of working alongside craftsmen. I'm sorry he's gone." "How did you know he was gone?" "Because if Michael Brennan were alive, I believe he would have come back here eventually. He would have found the nerve. He always found the nerve when it truly mattered." Tom picked up the hammer from the floor. His voice had become quieter. "The fact that you're here alone tells me what I need to know." Lily finished her deliveries with the mechanical precision of someone whose body is carrying out its assigned tasks, while the mind is elsewhere working through something too large and too tangled to resolve quickly. Doc Cross's office received its linens with polite efficiency. The saloon received its linens with less efficiency and more of the kind of attention she had the folding knife in her pocket for, though, in the event the knife was not required. She returned to Murphy's rooms in the early afternoon. Kate listened to what Tom had said without interrupting, sitting across the kitchen table with a cup of coffee. She was not drinking, her expression moving through a sequence of reactions that ended somewhere in the vicinity of unsurprised but troubled. "Isaiah Stone's death," Kate said when Lily finished. "Tom's never believed it was an accident. Neither have I, for what that's worth. Kane is too young to have been involved in 1858, but his partner isn't." Kate set down the cup. "Pike was working as a carpenter's assistant in Silverwood that year. Before the money, before the property, before any of it. The pieces were not yet assembled into a picture, but Lily could feel them in her hands, their edges and weights, the way you feel puzzle pieces before you can see how they connect. Gerald Pike, a stolen formula, a convenient accident, a poor man who became wealthy within a year of his employer's death. 30 years of that wealth compounding into power, into property, into the political influence of a town councilman whose word carried weight with the sheriff in the merchant class and the community that had been built on top of a crime no one had ever been required to answer for. She was still working through it when 3 days after Tom's revelation, she was standing in Stonewood Carpentry's workshop with Tom Fletcher's completed chest on the workbench in front of her and Jonah Stone's gray eyes watching from across the room. The arrangement had come through Tom as promised, negotiated with the specific practicality of men who have known each other long enough to skip the social preamble and go directly to terms. Jonah needed help with Tommy's schoolwork, someone to keep the workshop organized while he focused on major commissions, and someone to handle the small repairs that accumulated when the primary craftsman was occupied with the larger work. $3 a week and the use of the workshop tools as needed for Tom's chest, she had accepted. Not because she had forgiven the cold rejection, which was not a thing she had been asked to forgive and would have forgiven or not on her own schedule regardless, but because $3 was more than she would earn anywhere else in Silverwood in the current climate, and because something about the workshop pulled at her in a way she was not yet ready to examine too closely. The smell of it, the quality of the work, the sense of being in a space where things were made carefully and with respect for the material. And because the thread that connected her father to Isaiah Stone was anchored here in this workshop, and she wasn't going to find the other end of it by staying at Murphy's rooms. Jonah treated her as an element of the workspace, useful and in its assigned position. When he spoke to her, it was in the minimal language of task assignment. The liniment she offered for his back, which she had noticed him favoring with the careful attention she gave to all things that were not as they appeared to be, he accepted on the third day with a small, unexpected concession That was the closest she had yet seen to a human response from him. He smiled, just barely, just the slight curve of a mouth that had forgotten the musculature required for the fuller expression. Gone before it fully arrived, but real. "You're persistent," he said. "I learned from the best. My father never gave up on anything worth keeping." The smile disappeared. Something moved through the gray eyes and then was gone. He went back to work. Tommy, in contrast, attached himself to Lily with the straightforward completeness of a child who has decided you are trustworthy and is not interested in hedging that determination. He followed her through the workshop, asking questions about wood grain and tool angles and whether it was true she could read a blueprint. He sat across from her at the workbench for his afternoon lessons and worked through his reading assignments with a focus he did not apply when he was working alone, which told her what she had already suspected, that the difficulty was not ability, but the absence of someone who made the work feel like a conversation, rather than a solitary obligation. He was bright, genuinely bright, the kind of intelligence that expresses itself in questions, rather than answers, in wanting to understand the mechanism, rather than simply knowing the result. Given time and the right attention, he would be remarkable. On the fourth afternoon, while Tommy was working on his reading and Jonah was across the workshop running a long walnut board through a preliminary surfacing, Lily took the forged letter out of her pocket and held it toward the light from the east window. The watermark was exactly as she remembered. "Mr. Stone." He did not stop planning. "What?" "This paper, the letter that brought me here. Can you look at it?" A pause. The planning stopped. He crossed the workshop with the unhurried stride of a man who controls the pace of everything in his environment, took the letter from her hand and held it to the window light. She watched his face. There it was, the jaw tightening. The specific quality of controlled anger that she had come to recognize as his signature response to things that violated his sense of how the world should be ordered. "This is from my office." He turned the letter in the light, showing her the faint watermark, the manufacturer's mark pressed into the paper during production. "I have a supply of this exact stock. I noticed sheets missing after Kane was here in August looking at a cabinet commission." He handed the letter back. "He stole it. He came here to your workshop and took paper from your desk in order to write a convincing forgery in your name. That's what the evidence suggests. And sent it to a specific agency in Philadelphia. A specific address, a specific format, detailed knowledge of how the mail-order bride system actually operates." She folded the letter back into her pocket. "That's a great deal of effort for a prank." Jonah was quiet for a moment. In the corner of the workshop, Tommy appeared to be entirely focused on his reading slate, but Lily had noticed over the past several days that the boy had inherited his uncle's quality of observant stillness, the ability to seem occupied while actually attending carefully to whatever was happening in the room. "He wants the land," Jonah said finally. "He's been applying pressure for months. Contracts that should come to me go to his preferred suppliers. Lumber arrives with damage that wasn't there when it was loaded. Tools go missing." He turned back toward his workbench. "I've been managing it." "He's escalating," Lily said. "Using me against you was escalation." "It was also," Jonah said, and she heard something in his voice that was not quite anger, but was its close neighbor, an act that crossed a line, using someone who had done nothing wrong as an instrument of something like this. She looked at him for a moment. Then she reached into her carpet bag and took out the bundle of papers Tom Fletcher had given her 2 days ago. The old plans and diagrams, the architectural drawings with their marginal annotations in 2 different hands. She spread them on the workbench. Jonah looked at them. He did not speak immediately. He moved closer slowly, his hands going to the edges of the papers with the instinctive care of a craftsman handling old material. "I've never seen these," he said. "Tom saved them from your father's workshop. The week after your father died, the workshop burned. Tom had taken these home to study a joint technique your father had developed. He's had them ever since waiting." Jonah's eyes moved across the drawings. She watched him take in the 2 handwriting styles in the margins, the interleaved annotations of men working through a problem together, questioning each other, building on each other's observations in the collaborative way that good partnerships operate. "This is the varnish formula," she said, pointing to a section of notation in the right margin. "Or part of it. See where the page ends." The lower right corner of the sheet was torn away. Clean, deliberate, not an accident of time. Someone removed the final mixture ratios, Jonah said. His voice had gone quiet in a different way than his usual quiet, not the controlled quiet of a man managing his responses, but the involuntary quiet of someone absorbing something that requires a moment to become real. The formula is incomplete as it stands. Whoever tore that section away took the part that makes it workable. Lily reached into her carpet bag again and produced a folded paper, a business receipt she had found 3 days ago in the stack of documents Kate kept for Town Matters. Kane's Mill advertising a proprietary waterproof treatment at 3 times standard lumber pricing. Kane Industries has been selling waterproof timber with a proprietary formula for 6 years, at premium prices. Jonah held the receipt. His hands were steady. Everything else about him was very still. He's been using it all this time, he said. Not a question. Mock Kane directly. He's too young. He was a child in 1858. She placed the last document in front of him, the land deed transfer she had spent 2 evenings researching in the town record office, where the clerk, a small, nervous man named Horace, who had been visibly intimidated by Kane's name, but visibly more intimidated by Lily's specific and methodical questions, had eventually located what she needed. But his partner wasn't. The deed showed a transfer dated September 1859, 1 year after Isaiah Stone's death, in which Gerald Pike, listed as a laborer, had purchased a substantial parcel of Silverwood property at a price that was entirely inconsistent with what a laborer in 1859 could reasonably have accumulated. A carpenter's assistant who suddenly had the resources to invest in property. The pieces were assembling themselves now, with the terrible logic of things that have been true for a long time and have simply been waiting for someone to lay them out in the right sequence. Pike, Jonah said. Pike killed your father, took the formula, built his stake on it, invested in Kane when Kane arrived, and showed the right kind of potential, and has been profiting from your father's work for 3 decades. The silence in the workshop was complete. Tommy had stopped pretending to read. He was looking at his uncle with the expression of a child who understands that the conversation happening in front of him is of a different order than the conversations he usually witnesses, something that will matter in ways he cannot yet fully articulate. Jonah set the deed down on the workbench beside the old drawings. He stood very still for a long moment, looking at the evidence in front of him. We need proof, he said finally. Real proof. Enough to take to a lawman with jurisdiction outside Pike's reach. Pike would keep documentation somewhere private, his office in the town hall, his home, somewhere he controls access to. Lily met his eyes. The journal. A man like Pike, who has spent 30 years believing he was smarter than everyone around him, would keep a record. Men like that always do. It's the only form of honesty available to them. You're describing breaking into the councilman's private office. I'm describing the only way we get in front of a federal marshal with something that holds up. Jonah looked at her for a long moment. In the gray eyes, she could see the weight of what she was proposing. The legal exposure, the risk, the fact that Kane owned the local sheriff, and a failed attempt would not simply result in arrest, but in something considerably more permanent than that. If we're caught, he said, there's no recourse. Bodine would hand us to Kane and Pike before we were done explaining ourselves. I know. You've been in Silverwood for a week. I know that too. Why? He was not asking why she wanted justice, which was obvious. He was asking something more fundamental, the question that underlies every act of significant risk, the question of what makes a person willing to walk into danger for something that is not yet theirs. Because my father was part of this partnership, she said. His work was part of what was stolen. And because I came 2,000 miles to build something, and I am not going to do it on top of a 30-year crime that the people responsible for it have decided no one will ever make them answer for. She held his gaze. And because the people who get away with things, she said, get away with them because everyone who could stop them decides the cost is too high. I'm tired of that being the way it goes. The forge light was changing as the afternoon deepened, the warm gold of direct sun shifting toward the longer, cooler light of early evening. In the workshop, it fell across the old drawings and the new evidence in a way that made the whole arrangement look like something deliberate, like a table laid for a particular kind of reckoning. Jonah Stone looked at the drawings his father and her father had made together. He looked at the receipt that documented 30 years of theft. He looked at the deed that placed Gerald Pike at the exact intersection of motive an opportunity. Then he looked at Lily. Something changed in his face. The walls did not come down, they were too well constructed for that, but something behind them shifted, rearranged itself, made room for a new determination that had not been there before. All right, he said, we plan it properly. We get one chance. If we fail, they bury us and walk away clean. Then we won't fail. That evening, Kate arrived at the workshop with her face set in the particular configuration that Lily had come to recognize as the delivery of bad news that has already been assessed for severity and found to be considerable. Kane had filed a complaint with the town council. 3 co-signatories, all of them business owners with financial exposure to Kane's goodwill. The complaint alleged fire code violations at Stonewood Carpentry and demanded a formal inspection. The inspection was scheduled for 3 days hence. If they find violations, Kate said, and they will find whatever they've been sent to find, the workshop closes until repairs are made. Repairs that will require money. Jonah doesn't currently have liquid in time during which every commission in the pipeline gets canceled or picked up by someone else. 3 days. The clock that had been running underneath everything since Lily arrived in Silverwood had just become visible. Jonah looked at Lily. The question in his eyes was not a question she could answer for him. It was one only he could answer, the question of whether he was willing to do the thing that needed to be done with the full understanding of what it would cost if it went wrong. She saw him make his decision. Tonight, he said, simply, quietly, the way a man names a course of action he has accepted. Kate looked between them, taking in whatever was visible in their expressions, and arrived at an understanding that made her pull off her apron with a decisive motion. I'm done being safe, she said. 5 years I've been safe. 5 years since Walter died and I decided not to make noise. Safe and miserable and watching this town get smaller while Kane gets larger. She folded the apron over the back of a chair. Tell me what I can do. And so the 3 of them sat down together in the amber workshop light with the old drawings and the new evidence spread between them and began to plan the thing that needed to happen before the 3 days ran out. Tommy sat in the corner, his reading slate forgotten in his lap, watching the adults with the serious attention of a child who understands that the world is sometimes larger and more dangerous than the space designated for children, and that the people he loved most were about to walk into the larger and more dangerous part of it. He did not ask to come. He did not beg them not to go. He simply watched and understood and waited in the particular way of children who have already lost too much to pretend that the people they love are invincible. Outside the workshop, the autumn dark came down over Silverwood with the efficiency of mountain nights which do not arrive gradually, the way lowland nights do, but fall with the completeness of something that has been waiting all day for its moment. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in an hour. The stars appeared in the particular abundance they achieve at altitude, more stars than seemed reasonable, more than the sky seemed large enough to hold. Lily looked at them through the east window while the planning continued and thought about her father, the man who had taught her to read wood grain, and the man whose bones were somewhere in the dark of the mountain, and about the distance between those 2 men, and about the kind of justice that is the only thing that closes distances like that. She thought, I am going to finish what you could not. She thought, I am not leaving until I do. The sun was already low when Lily returned to Tom Fletcher's smithy at the hour they had agreed upon. The sky behind the western peaks bleeding out in shades of copper and old rust, the kind of sunset that looks like something ending rather than something merely concluding for the day. The forge had been banked for the evening, but the warmth of it still lived in the stone walls, and Tom Fletcher sat on a stool near the cold anvil with his hands on his knees and the expression of a man who has been deciding for several hours how much of a thing to say. He looked up when she came through the door. Sit down, he said. She sat on the bench near the wall, the same bench where she had set Kate's linens that morning a week ago, though it felt considerably longer than a week ago, felt like a different version of herself had made that delivery, and the version sitting here now had accumulated enough in the interval to be meaningfully changed. Tom Fletcher looked at his hands for a moment. Then he began. Lily already knew the broad shape of it. Kate had told her what the town knew. Tom told her what the town did not. The formula had been closer to finish than anyone outside the partnership understood. Not weeks away, days. Isaiah had run the final test on the 12th of September, and the results had been exactly what 2 years of work had promised. The treatment bonded with the wood fiber at the cellular level. It would last 50 years in mountain weather. It was worth more than the silver the territory had been built on. Pike had been in the workshop when Isaiah ran that final test. He had watched Isaiah make the notation in the margin of the drawings. He had understood in that moment exactly what he intended to do and how much time he had to do it. The formula was nearly finished, Tom said. His voice had the quality of recitation now, of a man delivering something he has rehearsed internally for many years, gone over so many times in the privacy of his own mind, that the words have achieved a kind of terrible smoothness. Isaiah and Michael were close to the final mixture ratios. They'd been testing samples for a month. Pike could see what it was worth, even if he couldn't see how to complete it himself. He paused. Outside, the Silverwood evening was quiet, a dog somewhere, the distant sound of the saloon beginning its nightly business, the mountains holding the darkness, the way they held everything permanently, without comment. September 14th, 1858, Tom said. Isaiah was working late. He often worked late when he was close to solving something, didn't like to break the thread of concentration. The others had gone home. Pike was supposed to have left at 5. Another pause longer this time. A support beam fell. The inquest found it had been improperly seated, attributed it to fatigue in the structure. Ruled accidental. Lily was very still. Isaiah Stone died before they could get him home, Tom said. He was crushed. He was dead by the time the doctor arrived. The forged warmth in the stone walls was the only warmth in the room. You don't believe it was an accident, Lily said. I have never believed it for a single day in 29 years. Tom's voice did not rise. It simply became more itself, more certain, the voice of a conviction so long held, it has become indistinguishable from knowledge. The beam was properly seated when I left that afternoon. I had checked it myself that morning because Isaiah had mentioned a small movement in the joint and I had confirmed it was sound. Someone moved it between 5 o'clock and the time Isaiah died. And Pike. Pike disappeared from Silverwood within a week of Isaiah's death. Took nothing that would suggest planning. Just gone. I thought at the time it was the action of a frightened man who had witnessed something terrible and could not bear to remain near it. He shook his head once slowly. It was the action of a man who had done something terrible and understood that the smart move was distance and time. And my father, Lily said. Tom looked at her with the expression of a man who has arrived at the part of the story he has dreaded arriving at since the conversation began. Michael knew, he said, or suspected. He came to me the morning after Isaiah died before the inquest and said that something was wrong, that the beam should not have fallen the way it fell. I told him he was in shock, that grief makes us look for reasons. I was wrong to dismiss him, and I have known I was wrong every day since. A long breath. 2 days after the inquest, Pike came back to collect a few items he had left at the workshop. Michael saw him. I don't know what passed between them. But that evening, Michael came to me and said he was leaving, going back east. Said he had family in Philadelphia, that Colorado was not going to work for him. Did he say why? The real reason? He said something I did not understand at the time. Tom's hands moved on his knees, a slow, unconscious movement, the hands of a man trying to hold something together. He said some things you cannot fight from where you are standing. You have to move before you can find the angle. Lily sat with him that for a moment. Her father had known. He had known what Pike had done and had understood with the specific clarity of a young man who has no money and no legal standing and no evidence that would survive a formal proceeding, that he could not fight it from where he was standing. He had chosen to live rather than die, trying to force a justice that was not yet available to him. She understood that. She did not approve of it, not entirely, but she understood it with the understanding that comes from having made similar calculations yourself, from having stood in a position where principle and survival were pulling in opposite directions and had to be reconciled. The formula, she said, the papers, the final mixture ratios. Gone. Pike took them when he left. The rest of the drawings, the incomplete versions, I had them at home from a study session the week before. That's what I gave you. But the completed ratios, the final working version, Pike has had it since 1858. She thought about the receipt she had shown Jonah. Kane Industries' proprietary waterproof treatment. 6 years of premium sales on lumber treated with a formula that belonged to dead men. Where did Pike go, she asked, after he left? I don't know exactly. Heard rumors over the years, nothing confirmed. And then 8 years ago, he arrived in Silverwood again. Older, prosperous, with Kane as his young partner and enough capital and social standing that no one questioned his history. Towns like this don't ask too many questions of men who arrive with money. And you never said anything. I said things. A flatness entered Tom's voice, the flatness of old frustration. I said them to the sheriff of the time who told me a 20-year-old grudge about a beam that the inquest had ruled accidental was not a matter requiring his attention. I said them to a territorial judge who came through on circuit, who listened politely and suggested I was confusing suspicion with evidence. He looked at his hands. I said them to myself every morning for 29 years. That's the one audience that never stopped listening. Lily stood up. She moved to the workbench where Tom's nearly finished chest sat the wooden panels she had rabbited and fitted now dry and true, the joints tight and sealed against whatever the mountain weather would eventually bring. The journal, she said. Pike's personal records. A man like Pike, who has operated this way for this long and never been questioned, who believes in his own superior intelligence, would keep a record. Not because he is careless, but because he is arrogant. Because he wants somewhere a version of events that acknowledges what he actually did and why. Tom looked at her. How do you know that? Because men who are never held accountable for things develop a relationship with those things that need somewhere to live. If no one else will recognize what they did, they recognize it themselves. In private, in writing. She turned to face him. He would keep it somewhere controlled. His office, his home, somewhere that has never felt vulnerable to him. His office in the town hall is private. He keeps it locked. I know. Tom Fletcher looked at her with the eyes of a man who is arriving at an understanding of what she is proposing and is simultaneously alarmed by it and not entirely surprised. Your father, he said carefully, would not have wanted you to take that kind of risk. My father, Lily said, is the reason I'm here. Whatever he wanted or didn't want, he ran out of time to finish this. I haven't. The old man was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached beneath his workbench and produced a key on a simple ring, old iron, the kind of key that opens a door that does not get opened often. The external staircase at the town hall, he said. Pike's window on the second floor east-facing. The frame has been warped since the spring thaw catches on the left side won't latch properly. I noticed it in March when I was doing ironwork on the building's hardware. Never mentioned it to anyone. He held out the key. This doesn't open anything in the town hall, but it will open the stable at the north end where I keep 2 horses that are better than they look and faster than anyone who hasn't ridden them would expect. She took the key. Tom Fletcher looked at her with an expression that contained in some proportion she could not have precisely quantified grief and pride, in the particular quality of recognition that occurs when one person sees clearly in another something that was present in someone they loved and lost. Michael Brennan's daughter, he said, not as identification, as something else, as a kind of acknowledgement that there are continuities in this world that outlast the individual lives through which they move. Lily put the key in her pocket and went back to Stonewood Carpentry to tell Jonah that the clock was down to hours. Gerald Pike sat in the good chair behind his desk, the chair he had purchased in Denver 12 years ago, at a price that would have seemed impossible to the young man he had been in 1858, and read through the quarterly accounts of Kane Industries with the methodical pleasure of a man who has learned that the most reliable form of satisfaction is arithmetic. The numbers were good. The numbers were always good, now had been good for long enough that their goodness felt less like fortune and more like the natural order of things, which was, he understood on some level, precisely the cognitive error that created vulnerability. But understanding a thing intellectually and feeling it differently were 2 separate operations. And at 65, with 30 years of accumulated comfort and authority between himself and the frightened young laborer who had made a decision on a September night that he had never regretted, the intellectual understanding was less present than it had once been. Kane came in without knocking, which was his habit, in one of his qualities that Pike found genuinely irritating, the casual assertion of equality in spaces that Pike understood to be his own. The woman has been talking to Tom Fletcher. Pike set down the quarterly accounts. Tom Fletcher talks to a great many people. He's an old man with time on his hands. She's been in his smithy twice. He gave her something. Papers, I think, from the description of what was under her arm when she left. Kane moved to the window, looked out at the evening street with the restless attention of a man who processes information primarily through movement. She's also been in the town record office. Horace says she was looking at property deeds from the late 1850s. The room became somewhat quieter than it had been. She's more than she appears, Kane said. I offered her work good money, straightforward arrangement. She turned it down in a way that suggested she wasn't simply being principled. She was being strategic. She has a destination in mind. Pike looked at the locked drawer of his desk, looked at the small iron safe in the corner of the room, looked at the window with its improperly latching frame that he had been meaning to have repaired since March and had not gotten around to. She's a young woman who arrived here with nothing, he said. She's trying to survive. She's a young woman who arrived here with nothing and within a week has positioned herself inside Jonah Stone's workshop, made herself essential to Tom Fletcher, and established an alliance with Kate Murphy. Kane turned from the window. In the lamplight, his face was the face of a man who has built his position on the accurate assessment of threats and does not like what the current assessment is showing him. That's not survival, that's strategy. What do you want to do? Her reputation first. I've already started. A few words in the right places, the suggestion that her arrangement with Stone is less professional than advertised. In a town this size, that kind of thing moves fast and sticks hard. And if that's not sufficient, Kane's expression did not change. That was one of his more unnerving qualities, that the discussion of certain things did not alter his face in any way that distinguished it from discussions of timber prices or shipping schedules. Then we addressed the problem more directly. Accidents happen in mountain towns. Women traveling alone are statistically vulnerable. Pike looked at him for a long moment. Not yet, he said. She's working for Stone. If she disappears, he'll connect it to us immediately. Then we move carefully. Kane picked up his hat from the peg near the door. But we move. After Kane left, Pike sat alone in his office for several minutes. Then he went to the locked drawer, opened it, and removed a leather-bound journal, dark brown, the covers worn soft with handling. He opened it to a page near the middle and read several entries, not because he had forgotten their content, but because reading them was a form of communion with the version of himself that had made those choices a reassurance that the choices had been rational, necessary, the only reasonable response to the circumstances. He believed this. He had believed it for 30 years. He returned the journal to the drawer, locked it, and went home. He did not know that in less than 48 hours, a young woman with her dead father's green eyes and her dead father's understanding of how wood fits together would be lying on the floor beneath his desk, with that journal's most important pages folded against her heart, listening to him discuss her murder with the same calm rationality with which he had discussed the beam 30 years ago. He did not know because he had made the mistake that powerful men who have never been held accountable always eventually make. He had confused the absence of consequence with the absence of danger. He had forgotten that the bill does not stop accumulating simply because no one has yet presented it. Midnight in Silverwood. The three of them stood in the alley behind the town hall, in the specific silence of people who have committed to a course of action and are now in the interval between commitment and execution, when there is nothing to do but wait and breathe, and not think too carefully about all the ways the thing could go wrong. Kate stood at the alley's north end in dark clothing, with a small brass bell in her right hand, the agreed signal if the night watchman deviated from his established route. Jonah stood at the base of the external staircase with his hand resting near the knife at his belt, not as an intention, but as an instinct, the body preparing itself. Lily stood at the foot of the stairs and looked up at the second-floor window of Gerald Pike's private office, and understood with a clarity that was not quite calm, but was adjacent to it, that everything that came after would depend entirely on what happened in the next 30 minutes. She thought about her father, the man she had called her father, the tools in her carpet bag with their worn handles. She thought about what Tom had said, some things you cannot fight from where you are standing. She thought, I am standing in the right place now. She started up the stairs. Each step announced itself. The wood was old, settled, the kind of old that knows every change in weather and temperature and expresses its knowledge audibly. She distributed her weight the way she had been taught, the way her father had taught her, the man she had believed was her father. And she understood that even his teaching, borrowed from a dead man's name, had come from somewhere real, that the knowledge of how to move with wood rather than against it had found its way to her through a chain of hands she was only now beginning to understand. Test before you trust. Move with the wood, not against it. She moved with the stairs. The window was exactly as Tom had described the frame, swollen on the left side, a gap of perhaps 3/4 of an inch between the pincerish and the frame where the wood had pushed against itself through the spring thaw and never fully receded. She worked her carpentry knife into the gap, the same knife she had carried since Philadelphia, and felt for the latch. The latch gave. The window opened inward on hinges that needed oil. A sound like a question asked in an empty room, and Lily climbed through into the darkness of Gerald Pike's private office. The smell of the room reached her before anything visual did. Cigar smoke, old paper leather polish, and beneath those surface notes, something deeper and less pleasant, the smell of a space that has been sealed around the same occupant for a long time, the particular atmosphere of a room that has heard one man think for decades. Moonlight came through the window in a narrow band, enough to see shapes without seeing details. The large desk in the center, the filing cabinets along the left wall, the iron safe in the right corner, small and squat and very solid. The neat stacks of documents on the desk surface organized with the precision of a man who has made order a form of self-assertion. She went to the desk first. The drawers were unlocked, which told her something about Pike's psychology. The same thing she had told Jonah when she proposed this: the man who has never been challenged stops preparing for challenge. The first drawer held routine correspondence, invoices, letters from contractors and council colleagues, nothing that served her purpose. The second held personal effects, a silver flask, 3 Cuban cigars, a small photograph of 2 people she did not recognize, and a leather-bound journal with dark brown covers worn soft with handling. She opened the journal and tilted it toward the moonlight. The handwriting was small and cramped and confident, the handwriting of a man who writes for himself rather than for readers, not particularly concerned with legibility beyond his own needs. She turned to the earliest entries and began to read. What she found there was the thing she had expected, and the thing she had hoped for, and the thing that, despite both expectation and hope, still landed with the weight of something confirmed rather than something suspected, which is always the heavier weight. February 1858. Isaiah Stone treats me as a laborer who has been granted the privilege of proximity to better men. He does not see what I contribute. Neither does Brennan. They will understand eventually that vision cannot be monopolized by men who were simply born into the right workshop. June 1858. The formula is nearly complete. I can see what it will be worth, what the territory will pay for a treatment that actually lasts. Stone and Brennan are too focused on the craft to see the commerce. Commerce is where the real fortune lives. Someone with the right kind of ambition could build an empire on this formula. The question is whether that someone will be the man who invented it or the man with the sense to recognize what it is. August 1858. I have copied the formula as far as it is developed. The final ratios are not yet confirmed. I will need to be present when they finalize it. September 12, 1858. The final ratios are confirmed. Stone ran the last test today. It works perfectly. I have the complete formula. What I do with it now is the only remaining question. September 14th, 1858. Tonight I make my decision. Stone will be working late. He always works late when he has recently solved something. The others will be gone. The support beam in the northwest corner has been a point of concern. It would not take much to ensure that concern becomes a certainty. Lily stopped reading. She stood in the moonlight of Gerald Pike's office with his journal in her hands and felt something move through her that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but partook of both the feeling of a thing being confirmed that you have been building toward and dreading in equal measure. Isaiah Stone's death, written down in the hand of the man who had planned it, the casual vocabulary of premeditation, the language of a man who had convinced himself that the distinction between what was his and what belonged to others was a matter of perspective rather than fact. She turned to the next page. September 15th, 1858. It is done. Stone is dead. The formula is secured. Brennan suspects but has no evidence. I know him well enough to know he will not fight without evidence. He will leave, and when he is gone, the question will be closed. I will wait. Time is the best erasure. In a year I will return with capital. I will build something legitimate. No one questions a prosperous man's history. Confession. Written in Pike's own hand. Dating detail intent outcome. 30 years old and as clear as the day it was written. She tore out the relevant pages with the careful precision of someone who understands that what she is removing must remain legible and intact and incontestable. 6 pages covering the period from June through September of 1858. She folded them once and placed them inside her dress. She went to the filing cabinet. The files were organized by year in subject Pike's administrative precision, evident in the careful labeling and consistent arrangement. She moved through them quickly, looking for anything that connected the current operation to the original theft contracts correspondence, anything bearing both Pike's name and evidence of the formula's commercial use. She was reaching toward the back of the third drawer when her fingers found something that was not a file, a resistance that was not the cabinet's back wall. She pressed on it, found the seam pressed again in the upper corner. A soft click, a hidden compartment, shallow perhaps 2 inches deep, running the full width of the drawer's back. Inside it lay a thin sheaf of papers, perhaps 12 sheets yellowed with age, and protected by the enclosed space from the deterioration that open air would have brought. She brought them to the moonlight. 2 handwriting styles interleaved in the margins. One she recognized from the drawings Tom had given her. The careful, precise notation that she had come to understand was Isaiah Stone's professional hand. The other was different in character, more fluid, less formal, the handwriting of someone who thinks faster than they write and has made peace with the resulting imprecision. She did not know that handwriting. She had no sample to compare it against. But something about it caught at her in a way she could not explain, a sense of familiarity that was not visual but deeper, the kind of recognition that operates below the level of conscious identification. The formula. Complete. The final mixture ratios that the torn drawing had been missing, the proportions that turned an interesting experiment into a working technology, all of it here in Pike's hidden drawer preserved for 30 years by the same careful instinct for documentation that had led him to write the confession in his journal. He had kept it because he needed it accessible to supervise production. He had kept the journal because men who are never held accountable develop a relationship with their crimes that needs a private audience. He had kept both here in this office because he had never in 30 years believed that anyone would come looking. She was placing the formula pages inside her dress alongside the journal pages when she heard it. Footsteps in the hallway outside. Not the tentative footsteps of a night watchman doing a routine pass. Deliberate footsteps, the footsteps of people who know where they are going and have reason to go there at midnight. And with them, the sound of a key in the outer hallway door. Lily looked at the window, calculated the distance, the time required, the noise the stairs would make. Not enough time. Not nearly enough time. She dropped to the floor and rolled under the desk in a single motion, pulling herself into the space between the desk's central drawer housing and the right side panel, drawing her knees to her chest and her arms in and making herself as small as the space required, which was very small indeed. She pressed one hand over her mouth. The door opened. Lamplight flooded the room, destroying the careful darknesses that had been her protection, turning the space from something navigable into something exposed. She could see the floor in sharp detail now. The scuff marks on the boards near the filing cabinets, the shadow of the desk's legs extending toward the window, the feet of 2 men as they entered. Expensive boots, canes, older boots, well-maintained, the boots of a man who buys quality and keeps it. Pikes. The window is open, Kane said. His voice in the enclosed space was the voice she had heard in the dining room of Murphy's rooms, smooth and controlled, and carrying that particular quality of intelligence that makes intelligence itself threatening. You are paranoid about leaving windows open, which means someone opened it. You're imagining threats. Pike moved toward his desk. Lily could see his feet stop 2 feet from the desk's front edge. Who in this town would dare break into my office? The Brennan woman. Kane moved along the wall and Lily tracked his feet as he went to the filing cabinets, stood before them, reached out and touched the third drawer. She stopped breathing. He pulled the drawer open. She heard him moving the files, heard him reach the back, heard, or perhaps imagined she heard the moment when his fingers found the seam of the hidden compartment. But he did not press it. He was not looking for it. He was checking whether the files had been disturbed and to a cursory examination they had not been because she had left them exactly as she had found them. He pushed the drawer closed. "She's been asking questions about property records," Kane said. "Old deeds, transactions from the 1850s. He moved to the desk. Lily could see his boots 6 inches from her face. She could smell the polish on them. "She's working towards something." "Let her work," Pike said, and Lily heard in his voice the absolute confidence of a man who has not been threatened in so long that he has lost the physical sense of what a real threat feels like. "What can she find?" "Old transactions that are a matter of public record. Tom Fletcher's suspicions, which I have managed for years. A forged letter that can be attributed to a prank without difficulty. She's inside Stone's workshop. Stone is not a fool. Stone is a grieving man who makes furniture. He is not an investigator." A pause. The lamplight moved as one of them shifted position. "The woman is the problem," Kane said. "Stone without her is manageable. Stone with her is something else." "Then we manage her." "I intend to. I've been careful. Patience is the correct approach. Ruin her reputation first close every employment door, let the winter do part of the work. By February, she'll be desperate enough to accept whatever terms I offer, or desperate enough to leave. And if she doesn't respond to those terms—" Kane was quiet for a moment. The quality of that quiet was different from the quiets that had preceded it in the conversation. It had a specific texture, the texture of a subject being handled with care, not because it is sensitive, but because it is practical. "Accidents happen in mountain towns," he said. "Women traveling alone encounter difficulties. It happens often enough that a single additional instance would not draw particular attention." Pike made a sound that was not quite agreement and not quite refusal, but existed in the space between them. "Not yet. The timing needs to be correct. Of course, for now the soft approach. But I want her gone before spring." They talked for several more minutes, the conversation moving across other business. The upcoming council inspection of Stone's workshop, a timber contract with a railroad company that would require specific documentation. And throughout it all, Lily lay beneath the desk with her hand over her mouth and the stolen pages against her heart, in the specific understanding of a woman who has just heard practical men discuss her death as a scheduling matter. The lamplight began to move toward the door. Then she heard it, distant but clear in the mountain quiet, the soft ringing of a small brass bell. Kate's signal. The night watchman was deviating from his route. "Coming this way." "We go," Kane said immediately. The boots moved toward the door. "Check the street." "My office, Vincent." "At midnight with an open window and someone clearly inside. Use your head." The boots stopped near the door. "Tomorrow we put a proper lock on that window frame. Tonight we leave." The lamplight withdrew. The door closed. The key turned darkness again. Lily did not move for what felt like a very long time, but was probably 60 seconds. She counted her own heartbeats because they were the only reliable measure of time available to her in the dark under the desk of a man who had just discussed killing her. At 100 she moved. She came out from under the desk, slowly listening, hearing nothing but the building's ambient sounds, the creak of old timber, responding to the temperature drop of the mountain night. She crossed to the window, looked out. The alley was empty. Jonah and Kate had moved when they saw Kane and Pike approaching, had hidden themselves in the deeper shadows, were waiting. Lily climbed through the window. She went down the stairs faster than she had come up, them not caring about the noise now, speed mattering more than silence. She was at the third step from the bottom when a figure stepped out of the shadow at the alley's edge, tall and broad-shouldered, and for one terrible half-second, she was back in the stagecoach's second night, back in every moment when the shape of a man in darkness had meant danger. Then the figure spoke. Thank God. Jonah's voice rough with something that was not quite fear, because he was not a man who permitted himself fear in the conventional expression of it, but was the thing that lives in the same part of the body as fear and produces the same quality of unsteadiness when it releases. I thought they'd found you. She came down the last 3 steps and walked straight into the space of him, not quite falling, not quite embracing, simply arriving at the nearest solid thing with enough speed that he put his hands on her shoulders to steady her. And they stood like that for a moment in the alley dark, her heart slamming against her ribs, and the stolen pages pressing against her skin, and his hands warm and sure through the fabric of her dress. I got it, she said. Her voice came out lower than she intended. A whisper. The journal entries. The formula. Everything we need. Kate materialized from the shadow at the alley's far end, her face pale under the moonlight, but her eyes entirely steady. They're at the sheriff's office now, talking to Bodine. We have perhaps 10 minutes before they come back to do a proper search. The horses, Jonah said. Tom's stable. North End. He left them ready. Lily looked at both of them. We go tonight. We can't wait for morning. They ran. Through the sleeping streets of Silverwood, three people carrying 30 years of buried truth through the autumn midnight, moving toward whatever came next with the particular combination of terror and clarity that attends the moment when you have passed the point of return, and the only viable direction is forward. They took Tom's horses from the north stable at 12 minutes past midnight, moving through the dark with the specific economy of people who understand that every second spent in Silverwood after this moment is a second working against them. Tom had left both animals saddled, their saddlebags packed with what a man who has spent 50 years in mountain country understands to be necessary dried meat. Hardtack 2-wool blankets each, a canteen matches wrapped in oilcloth, and in the right saddlebag of the larger horse, the old army revolver he had carried since before Lily's father was born. Kate stood at the stable door. She had not cried. Lily had not expected her to cry, had understood from the first night in the boarding house kitchen that Kate Murphy was not a woman who spent tears on things that required action instead. But there was something in her face in the lamplight of the stable doorway that was more than practicality and less than composure, the expression of a woman who has decided to let something go that she would have preferred to keep close. Tommy was beside Tarner. He had insisted on coming to the stable, and neither Jonah nor Lily had found a way to refuse him that did not feel like a lie. He stood with his hands in his trouser pockets, in the way of boys who are trying to occupy their hands with something that will not reveal how frightened they are, and he looked at Jonah with the direct, uncomplicated gravity of a child who has already lost more than children should lose, and understands at some level below language what the shape of loss looks like before it arrives. Jonah crouched down in front of him. He did it slowly with the deliberateness of a man performing an action he has been rehearsing in his mind for some time and wants to get right. He put both hands on Tommy's shoulders and looked at him at eye level, the gray eyes serious and present in a way that they were not always present, in a way that grief had been making increasingly difficult for 3 years and was now in this moment refusing to make difficult any longer. I'm coming back, Jonah said. Tommy looked at him. I have broken exactly one promise in my life, Jonah said. I promised your father I would look after you. I have done that. This is the second promise. I am coming back. Tommy's jaw worked for a moment. Then he said with the precision of a child who has thought carefully about what he wants to say and is choosing his words accordingly, you and Lily both. Jonah glanced at Lily. Something moved between them in that glance, something that did not require words and would have been diminished by them. Both of us, Jonah said. Tommy nodded once, the nod of a person accepting terms they did not set but can live with. Then he stepped forward and put his arms around his uncle's neck with the complete physical abandon of childhood, the kind of embrace that holds nothing back because it has not yet learned the self-protective habit of holding back. And Jonah held him with both arms and closed his eyes for a moment and was entirely present in a way that he had not permitted himself to be present in 3 years. Kate's hand found Lily's arm. The grip was brief and firm, the grip of a woman communicating what she could not say in front of the boy. Bring him home, Kate said quietly. Bring yourself home too. We will. They rode north out of Silverwood in the darkness, keeping off the main road, moving through the timber at the pace the darkness and the terrain allowed, which was slower than Lily wanted, but faster than caution, strictly recommended. The horses Tom had called better than they looked proved themselves almost immediately moving through uneven ground, with the sure-footed confidence of animals that have been ridden in mountain country long enough to have developed their own judgment about where to put their feet. Jonah rode ahead where the trail was clear, dropping back beside her where it narrowed. He did not speak much. This was not unusual for him, but the quality of his silence was different tonight, less defended, less a barrier, and more a kind of companionship. The silence of a man who has stopped spending energy on keeping people at a distance and is simply present with where he is and who is beside him. After an hour, they were above the tree line on the lower slope of the first ridge, And Silverwood was a scattering of amber lights far below, small and distant, the way a place looks when you have left it and are not certain when you will return. Lily looked back once. Then she looked forward. The Rockies in early autumn at night are a specific kind of beautiful that has nothing gentle about it. The peaks above them caught the moonlight in a way that made them look like something from a different category of existence than the world below, enormous and ancient and entirely indifferent to the small warm creatures moving across their lower slopes. The temperature had dropped another 10 degrees since they left town. Their breath came out in thin clouds that dissolved immediately into the cold, dry air. Kane will know by morning, Jonah said. Not a question. The window, Lily said. He said he would put a proper lock on it tomorrow. When he finds it already has one from the inside with the latch broken, he will know someone was there tonight. And he will count what's missing. The journal pages are torn. He will see the gaps immediately. She adjusted her grip on the reins. He will assume Denver. It is the only direction that makes sense. He knows these mountains better than we do. He knows the main routes better than we do. Tom's horses know the mountain better than Kane's men do. She had thought about this during the planning, had asked Tom specifically about alternative routes, about the trails that the early miners had cut before the main roads were established. Tom marked the old survey trail on a map. It adds half a day, but it does not follow the main pass. Kane's men will watch the main pass. Jonah was quiet for a moment. Half a day we don't have. Half a day we spend not being shot is a reasonable trade. He looked at her in the dark. That almost smile again, the one that came and went so quickly it was easy to miss, but which she had learned to watch for. Left at the split pine, she said, looking at Tom's hand-drawn map by the thin light of the moon. Then we follow the creek north until it bends east. They rode. The hours dissolved into the rhythm of it, hoofbeats and wind, and the vast, patient dark of the mountain, and somewhere in the middle of the night, they stopped to rest the horses at a place where a shelf of rock created a natural windbreak, and there was a small seep of water running cold from the stone. They sat close because the temperature demanded it, their backs against the rock, the horses tethered nearby. Jonah had a small fire going, careful and low, the kind of fire that gives heat without giving light. You can see from a distance, and in its warmth, Lily took the pages from inside her dress and looked at them for the first time since the office verifying that they had survived the ride intact. They had. Pike's handwriting was clear and damning in the firelight, the careful small script of a man writing for his own private record, which was the most honest thing he had ever done and the thing that was going to end him. My father saw him, Jonah said. He was looking at the fire, not at the pages which Lily was holding, but at the fire, at the particular quality of burning that fire achieves when there is no wind to disturb it. Isaiah, the night he died. My father came home and he told my mother that Isaiah had been working late and he was going back to check on him because the shop felt wrong when he left. A long pause. She told him not to go. Said it was late, said Isaiah was a grown man, said the shop would still be there in the morning. Another pause longer. He listened to her. He went to bed. In the morning he went to the shop and found what Pike had left. Lily was very still. He carried that for 20 years, Jonah said, that he didn't go back, that if he had gone back, maybe. He stopped. You can't know that. No, but he couldn't not know it either. That's the nature of that particular kind of regret. You can't prove it either way, so it stays. She thought about her own father, the man she had believed was her father, who had run from this place because he was young and frightened and had no evidence and no resources, and understood that fighting without those things was not courage, but simply dying for nothing. Who had gone east and built a life on another man's name and tried to be a father to a girl who was not his daughter and had given her everything he could, including the craft skills of a man he had never been. She thought about what it means to live inside a story that is not entirely your own. Your father was a good man, she said. Tom said it. Everything in those drawings says it. A man's work tells you who he is more honestly than anything else. Jonah looked at her. My father said that, he said quietly. I know. She held his gaze. Mine did too, or the man I called my father did. I think he learned it from yours. The fire crackled once and settled. Above them, the stars burned with the particular intensity they achieve at high altitude, more present than stars seen from below. More real, as though the atmosphere that softens them at lower elevations is itself a kind of lie. And this is what they actually are. Jonah reached out and adjusted the blanket she had around her shoulders. A small, unconscious motion, the motion of a man who has stopped thinking about whether to take care of someone and has simply started doing it. She did not move away. They slept in shifts, 2 hours each, the mountain cold keeping sleep shallow and watchful. When the first gray of pre-dawn began to separate the sky from the peaks, they were already moving again. It was Kate who had told Tommy the previous afternoon, in the quiet hour before supper, some portion of what was happening. Not all of it, but enough that when the man had appeared at the stable door that night, he had carried himself with a gravity that went beyond his 10 years, the gravity of a child who has been trusted with serious knowledge and intends to be worthy of that trust. What Tommy did with that knowledge while Lily and Jonah were on the mountain was this. He went to Tom Fletcher's smithy at first light. He sat on the bench by the wall without being asked and waited with the patience of a child who has learned that waiting is sometimes the most useful thing available to you. When Tom came in from feeding the chickens he kept in the yard behind the smithy, Tommy was there, his hands folded in his lap, his face carrying the expression of someone who has something to report and is waiting for the appropriate moment. They left the window open, Tommy said. In Pike's office. I heard Mr. Kane telling Sheriff Bodine this morning. He was very loud about it. Tom looked at the boy for a moment. And Kane's men, Tommy said. 4 of them rode him out on the main pass road 20 minutes ago. Mr. Kane told them Denver. Tom sat down on his stool. He looked at the boy with the specific quality of attention that adults give children when they are understanding for the first time or more fully than before exactly what they are dealing with. How do you know all this? Tommy's expression was the expression of a child who finds this question slightly insulting. I was in the alley behind the sheriff's office. The window was open. Tom picked up his hammer, set it down, picked it up again. Your uncle know you do things like this. No, Tommy said, but Miss Lily would. Tom looked at the hammer in his hand for a long moment. Then he stood up and went to the corner of the smithy where he kept the things he was not ready to throw away, but had no immediate use for, and he found what he was looking for, a small brass telescope, old, one of the lenses slightly scratched, but functional. Main Pass Road, he said. 4 men. You're certain? I counted them. Tom handed him the telescope. There's a ridge above the south fork of Silver Creek where you can see 3 miles of the Main Pass Road from the right angle. You know where that is? Tommy took the telescope with the gravity of someone receiving a commission. I can find it. You go there, you watch. If they turn back toward the survey trail before noon, you come back and you tell me immediately. Can you do that? Yes. And Tommy, the old man's voice dropped. You stay on the ridge. You don't follow them. You don't try to help. You watch and you report. Understood. Understood. The boy went. What Tom did next was saddle his remaining horse, the old gray that had not been pressed into serious service for 2 years, and ride to the western edge of town, where a man named Hector Reyes ran the telegraph office, and send a message to the United States Marshal's office in Denver that was careful and specific and named 2 men and 1 crime and requested the presence of a federal officer in Silverwood within the week. He signed it with his own name. It was the most frightening thing he had done in 29 years. He had already given Jonah the partnership papers the night before, pressed into the bottom of the saddlebag, beneath the dried meat and the oilcloth matches, without ceremony, without explanation beyond what Jonah's face told him was already understood. 30 years he had kept them. They belonged to whoever was going to Denver. Villain interlude: Kane's calculation. Vincent Kane stood in Pike's office in the early morning light and looked at the filing cabinet drawer and the empty space where the hidden compartment had been, and felt something he had not felt in a long time. He was impressed, not pleased, not relieved. Impressed the way you are impressed by an opponent who has done something you would not have expected them capable of, and which has now created a problem you must solve with less time than you would prefer. Pike was sitting behind his desk with the specific stillness of a man who has spent 30 years managing risk and is now confronting the possibility that he has miscalculated in a fundamental way. He was not panicking. Kane gave him that. Whatever else Pike was, he was not a man who panicked. But the calculation behind his eyes was running visibly, which was unusual for a man who normally kept his thinking entirely interior. How much did she take? Pike said. The journal pages from 1858, all of them. Kane closed the drawer. And the formula, the complete version from the compartment. The formula cannot be authenticated without the original partnership documents. Tom Fletcher has the original partnership documents. He has had them for 30 years. He has simply not had anyone to give them to who could do anything with them. Kane moved to the window, looking out at the street where Silverwood was beginning its morning business, in ignorance of what had happened in this office while it slept. Until now. Pike was quiet. "She is going to Denver," Kane said. "She has the journal pages naming you for Isaiah Stone's death. She has the formula pages which, combined with Fletcher's originals, constitute a complete chain of evidence for 30 years of commercial theft. She has the land deed which establishes your financial motive. And she has Jonah Stone, who is Isaiah Stone's son and the rightful heir to the original partnership's assets." He turned from the window. "If she reaches a federal marshal with all of that, we are finished. Both of us. I for conspiracy, you for murder. My name in that journal is not legally sufficient. It is sufficient to open an investigation, and an investigation will find the rest." Kane put on his hat. "I have sent 4 men to the main pass road. If she is taking the route anyone would take, they will stop her before she reaches the canyon. And if she is not taking that route, then she is smarter than 4 men on fast horses, and we deserve what comes." He moved toward the door. "I suggest you spend the morning deciding what version of events you want to offer if she reaches Denver before my men reach her, because I have no intention of being the only one who answers for this." He left Pike alone in the office with the empty drawer in the morning light and 30 years of careful accumulation suddenly feeling very much like a structure built on ground that was never as solid as it appeared. The pursuit. They heard the riders at mid-morning on the second day. 5 of them, not 4. Kane had added a man, which meant he had understood that the survey trail was a possibility and had sent someone who knew it. The sound carried differently in the mountain air than it would have at lower elevation, arriving cleaner, and from a deceptive direction, and Lily heard it first because she had been listening for it since they left Silverwood, the specific irregular percussion of horses moving fast over uneven ground. "East," she said. Jonah heard it a second after her, and his hand went to the revolver in his saddlebag. "How far?" "Half a mile, maybe less." She looked at the terrain ahead at the trail as it wound between 2 rock faces and then opened onto a section of exposed ridge before dropping toward the tree line below. "We can't outrun them on the open section." "We don't have to outrun them." He was looking at the rock faces on either side of the trail. "We have to get past the open section before they see us. Once we're in the trees below, they lose the angle." The horses moved. Lily did not use the word gallop because the terrain did not permit a true gallop, but Tom's animals understood urgency in the way that good horses understand it, without being told, translating the shift in their riders' bodies into speed that the ground allowed, and no more than that. They crossed the exposed ridge section in 3 minutes that felt considerably longer the open sky above them, and the valley far below, and the sound of pursuit growing not louder but more defined, which was in some ways worse. They were 50 yards into the tree line when the first rider crested the ridge behind them. Lily did not look back. She bent low over the horse's neck and let the animal find its own path through the timber, trusting its eyes and its footing in the way her father had taught her to trust a good tool completely and without second-guessing once you have verified the quality. Behind her, she heard shouting. Then the particular sharp, flat sound of a rifle shot that went into the rock face to their left, nowhere close a warning or a miss. "Keep going," Jonah said. He was beside her now, the 2 horses nearly parallel between the trees. "There's a creek crossing in a quarter mile. Once we're across and into the boulder field on the other side, horses can't follow. They'll go around. It takes them an hour to go around. We'll be on the south slope by then, and there are 3 ways down from the south slope. They can't cover all 3. She rode. The creek crossing was exactly where Tom's map said it would be, a ford perhaps 30 feet wide, where the water ran fast and cold over a gravel bottom, deep enough in the center to reach the horses' knees. They crossed it at a pace that was too fast for safety and not fast enough for comfort, the cold water shocking against her boots, where it splashed up and came out on the far bank and into the boulder field that Tom had described. Boulder field was accurate as a description, but insufficient as a picture. It was a landscape of massive granite blocks that had come down from the cliff above, at some point in the geological past. Each boulder the size of a small building arranged in the specific chaotic geometry of catastrophe, with passages between them that were narrow and irregular, and which someone who knew the territory could navigate, and which someone who did not know the territory could spend hours searching. Tom Fletcher had known this territory. His map was detailed in specific notations in his careful smith's hand, indicating which passages were viable and which were traps, which boulders offered purchase, and which were unstable. Lily read it while they moved, calling directions to Jonah, who translated them into motion, and the boulder field gave way to the south slope in a way that felt, after everything, almost generous. They stopped in the shelter of a large overhang on the upper south slope and listened. The riders had not crossed the creek. They could hear them on the far bank, the sound of horses refusing the fast water, the voices of men arguing about it. Then silence, which meant they had gone to look for the way around. 1 hour. Jonah was breathing hard. He looked at her with that gray-eyed steadiness that she had come to understand was not the absence of feeling, but the presence of something more controlled than feeling, something that had been trained by years of working with tools that required precision and forgave nothing. "You're bleeding," she said. He looked down at his left forearm, a cut not deep from a branch or a rock in the boulder field, the kind of injury that happens in pursuit through difficult terrain and announces itself after the urgency has passed. He looked at it with the evaluative expression of a carpenter assessing damage, determining whether it affects function. "It's nothing," he said. She reached into her saddlebag for the cloth Kate had packed, the same practical foresight that had put the dried meat and the matches and the army revolver in their bags. She wrapped the cut with the efficiency of someone who knows how to do this and is not interested in doing it elaborately. His hand was still while she worked. "Tom sent that telegram," he said. "I know he did. It was in his face when we left. He was already deciding. If he did, it will take days to reach anyone who can act on it. We still need to get there ourselves. Estelle." "I know." He looked at his wrapped arm. Then he looked at her. "You could have gone to Denver without me, the first week, when I turned you away. You had enough information even then to know something was wrong. Tom would have talked to you. I didn't have the journal pages then. You would have found another way." She considered this. It was true, probably. She was good at finding other ways. It was, in some sense, the primary skill that poverty and difficulty develop in a person, the ability to identify an alternative path when the direct one is blocked. "I didn't want another way," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry," he said. "For the first day, what I said, how I said it. You thought I was a stranger who had arrived to complicate your life. You were a stranger who arrived to complicate my life." And now, he looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through the gray eyes, something she had not seen there before, or had seen only in fragments, partial glimpses of a thing that had been keeping itself carefully hidden, and was now in the particular clarifying cold of the mountain and the particular irreversibility of what they had done and were doing, deciding not to hide anymore. "Now you're someone I would like to have the time to understand properly," he said, "when this is finished." It was not poetry. It was not a declaration. It was an honest statement of intent from a man who had spent 3 years building walls and was in this moment on a cold mountain with his arm wrapped in the law of 2 states, looking for both of them, telling her that he wanted the chance to know her when there was space enough to do it. She understood it completely. "Then let's go finish it," she said. The hour passed. Kane's men did not come back across the creek. Lily and Jonah rode south, keeping below the ridgeline, putting distance between themselves and the sound that had stopped. They came down the south slope in the early afternoon, and the entrance to the Aurora mine presented itself with the particular modesty of places that have been important for a long time and have stopped advertising it. A horizontal shaft cut into the hillside shored with timber that had been old when the mine was last worked. The entrance partly obscured by a growth of scrub oak that had established itself over the years, in which no one had come here with a reason to disturb it. Lily knew about the mine from Tom's map. He had marked it not as a destination, but as a landmark, a reference point for navigation on the south approach to the main trail that would bring them eventually around the base of the mountain and onto the Denver Road. She had noted it and moved on. But Jonah stopped. He had been ahead of her by 20 yards, reading the terrain, and he stopped with the specific stillness of a man who has recognized something. He dismounted without speaking and walked to the mine entrance and stood there for a moment. "My father's initials," he said when she came up beside him. She looked where he was looking. In the timber above the entrance, cut deep with a carving chisel and preserved by the dry mountain air, two letters, I.S., and beside them, smaller and less careful, as though added by a different hand in less certain circumstances, M.B. Michael Brennan. She stood very still. The wind moved through the scrub oak, a dry October sound, the sound of leaves that have finished their season and are waiting for the inevitable conclusion. Somewhere below them in the valley, far enough away to be theoretical rather than immediate, the sound of water over stone. She looked at the mine entrance, at the darkness beyond the scrub oak, cool and dry and containing whatever it contained. She thought about her father, about what Tom had told her, that Michael Brennan had seen Pike at the workshop 2 days after Isaiah's death, and that evening had told Tom he was leaving. She thought about a young man who knew what had happened and knew he had no way to prove it, and understood that Pike would not leave a witness in Colorado who might eventually find the nerve. She thought he did not go east immediately. She thought he came here first. She did not say any of this out loud. She simply walked to the mine entrance and took the lantern from her saddlebag, the small oil lantern Kate had packed with the same comprehensive practicality as everything else, and lit it with the matches in the oilcloth packet. Jonah followed her without question. Inside the mine was narrow and low-ceilinged for the first 20 feet, the timber shoring close and dark with age but structurally sound, and then it opened into a larger chamber where the original shaft had followed a vein of silver that had eventually run out. The lantern light reached the walls and the floor and the ceiling with reasonable confidence. The air was cold and completely still, the specific stillness of places that had been sealed from moving air for a long time. In the far corner of the chamber, half obscured by a natural shelf of rock that jutted from the wall at chest height, there was a shape that was not rock. She moved toward it. The lantern light arrived before she did, and she understood what she was looking at while she was still 6 feet away. Understood it in the way you understand something that you have been building toward without knowing you were building toward it. The understanding that is not surprise, because some part of you has already arrived at this destination and is simply waiting for the rest of you to catch up. Bones, the skeleton of a man seated against the wall with his back to the stone and his knees drawn up, the posture of someone who had sat down to rest and had not been able to stand again. The clothing had largely dissolved into fiber and dust, but the shape remained, and around the neck of the skeleton on a chain that had survived, because brass survives almost everything, a small oval locket. Jonah made a sound behind her. Not a word, just a sound. She knelt beside the skeleton and unclasped the locket from the chain with hands that were remarkably steady, steadier than she would have expected, steadier than the situation seemed to call for. The brass was dark with age, and the surface was marked with the particular texture of metal that has been handled often and then left untouched for a very long time. She opened it. The photograph inside had faded the way all photographs from that era faded, edges softening into gray, but the face remained. Young, perhaps 25. Strong cheekbones, a particular set to the jaw, eyes that held something between determination and sorrow. She knew that face. She had seen it every morning for 24 years whenever she looked into a mirror. The world did not tilt this time. She had run out of tilting. She simply sat with the knowledge, the way you sit with a weight you have been carrying for a long time once you set it down, understanding now that it was always there, that everything that came before this moment was the carrying and this was the setting down. Her real father had come to this mine on the 15th of September, 1858. He had come here because he knew Pike was looking for him, because a young man without money or evidence or legal standing had understood that running east was the only option, but had needed somewhere to go first, somewhere to think, somewhere to write down what he knew and leave it where it might someday be found. He had not made it out. Near the skeleton, preserved by the same cold, dry dark that had preserved the locket, several sheets of paper. She gathered them with the care of someone handling something irreplaceable. The handwriting on the largest sheet was the same fluid, slightly hurried hand she had seen in the margins of the formula drawings in Pike's filing cabinet, the hand she had recognized without being able to name. Her father's hand. Her real father's. The letter was addressed to no one in particular, which was what you wrote when you did not know who would find it or when it began. My name is Michael Brennan. I am a carpenter and a partner in the firm of Stone and Brennan, Silverwood, Colorado Territory. What I write here is the truth as I know it to be. He had written it all: Isaiah Stone's death, Pike's presence in the workshop that night, the formula, its components, its purpose, his own inability to fight what he knew without evidence that would survive a legal proceeding, his intention to go east and find a way to build something that could eventually come back and finish what needed finishing. He had not gone east. Something had stopped him here. Pike, perhaps, who had not been satisfied that a frightened young carpenter would stay frightened forever. The mine, perhaps, which had seemed like safety and had become something else. At the bottom of the letter in handwriting that was less steady than the rest, the handwriting of someone writing in difficult conditions or in the last of their strength. If you are reading this, I was not able to do what I meant to do. Find Tom Fletcher. He knows the beginning of this. Find whoever is left of what we built. The formula is worth something. The truth is worth more. Do not let them keep both. Jonah's hand found her shoulder. She did not speak for a long time. The lantern burned steadily in the still air of the chamber, making no noise, asking no questions. Outside the mine, the mountain waited with its enormous patience, the patience of things that have been in place long enough to understand that human urgencies are brief, and that what endures, endures not through force, but through being fundamentally true. I don't know who I am, she said finally. The words came out quieter than she intended, without drama. Simply the honest statement of a person who has just discovered that the map they have been using to navigate their own life was drawn by someone who did not know the territory. Jonah crouched beside her. He did not offer her a correction or a consolation or any of the various inadequate things that people offer each other when the ground gives way. He simply said what was true. You are the person who came 2,000 miles with 11 cents in a forged letter and did not stop. You are the person who walked into Kane's threat without flinching, and into Pike's office without hesitating, and through this mountain without turning back. His voice was level and certain, the voice he used when measuring something he had already measured twice and knew to be accurate. You are the only person who came here. That is enough. That is more than enough. She looked at him. Your father, he said, gesturing at the bones with the letter in hand, died trying to do what you came here to finish. Your other father gave you the tools to do it. Both of them made you. That is not confusion. That is just a longer story than most people get. She folded her father's letter, Michael Brennan's letter, her father's letter. She placed it inside her dress alongside Pike's journal pages and the formula, all of it pressed against her heart. She stood. Outside the mine, the sound of hoofbeats, not coming closer. Moving parallel below them on the valley trail, the sound of Kane's men making their circuit of the mountain and not finding what they were looking for. They had perhaps 2 hours before the circuit was complete and the search pattern would need to change. Denver, she said. Jonah was already moving toward the horses. The United States Marshal's office in Denver occupied the second floor of a building on Larimer Street that had been built to convey federal authority and succeeded primarily in conveying federal permanence, which in the territories amounted to the same thing. They arrived on the third morning road-worn and cold-stiffened, and carrying between them more evidence of a 30-year crime than most federal investigators accumulated in a career. The marshal's name was Thomas Wilson. He was 50 broad, with the particular unhurried quality of a man who has spent decades in the business of sorting truth from its various imposters and has learned that the primary tool of that work is patience. He received them in his office without apparent surprise, which Lily later understood was a professional habit rather than a reflection of his actual state of mind. She set the documents on his desk. Pike's journal pages, the formula in the 2 handwriting styles, the land deed, her father's letter from the mine, Tom Fletcher's partnership papers, which Jonah had carried in his own bag since Tom had pressed them on him the night they left, the business receipt documenting 6 years of commercial sales from a stolen formula. Wilson looked at each document in turn with the methodical attention of a man who is building something as he reads and will not rush the building because rushing it would compromise the structure. When he finished, he looked up. Where did you obtain the journal pages, he said. Lily met his eyes. I removed them from Gerald Pike's private office in the Silverwood Town Hall on the night of the 21st of September. You broke into a public official's office. I did. Wilson looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Jonah. Then he looked back at the documents. Miss Brennan, he said, you are asking me to arrest a town councilman for a murder committed 29 years ago on the basis of evidence that includes a document you obtained through a legal entry, a formula whose ownership will require legal argument to establish, and a letter written by a man who died before you were born. I am asking you, she said, to look at a dead man's confession in the 30-year record of commercial theft and a letter from a witness who was killed to prevent him from talking and determine whether the man responsible for all three should be held accountable. She did not raise her voice. She had not raised her voice in any of the moments in the past 3 weeks when raising it would have been the easiest and most satisfying option, and she was not going to raise it now. The question of how I obtained the confession does not change what the confession says. Wilson was quiet for a moment. There is also, Jonah said, speaking for the first time since they had entered the office, the matter of Vincent Kane sending 5 armed men into the mountains to prevent us from reaching you, which is its own crime separate from Pike's. Wilson looked at him. You can document that. I can describe the men and their horses and the direction from which they came. Tom Fletcher can document that Kane hired them. Tommy can document when they left and which direction they rode. He paused. He is 10 years old and his memory is precise. The marshal looked at the documents again. He looked at Lily. You understand, he said, that a man of Pike's standing in his community will have legal representation and resources and 30 years of accumulated goodwill to draw on. I understand that, she said. I also understand that the man in that journal wrote down exactly what he did and why. Lawyers are useful for many things. They are less useful when their client has written his own confession. Wilson picked up Pike's journal pages, read the September entries again slowly, set them down. We ride in 2 days, he said. I'll need a deputy and a warrant from the circuit judge. Can you be available to testify? We will be here, Lily said. They rode back to Silverwood 4 days later in a party of 6: Lily, Jonah, Marshall Wilson, 2 federal deputies, and a circuit court warrant with Gerald Pike's name on it. The mountains they crossed were the same mountains they had fled through 4 days before, but the direction made them different, the way all landscapes are changed by the direction you are traveling through them. Tom Fletcher was sitting on the steps of his smithy when they rode into Silverwood as though he had been expecting them, and had decided that the steps were the appropriate place from which to receive whatever arrived. He stood when he saw Wilson's badge. His face went through something complicated and then settled into a kind of relief that was so long overdue it had become almost physical, the relief of a man who has been holding something up for 29 years and has just been told he can put it down. Tommy was at Jonah's stirrup before the horse had fully stopped, his hands gripping the leather, and his face turned up with the expression of a boy who has been very carefully not worrying for 4 days and is now available to stop. Jonah dismounted and the boy was in his arms before his feet were fully on the ground. Kate stood in the doorway of Murphy's rooms across the street. She watched Jonah hold the boy, and she watched Lily dismount, and she said nothing, which was exactly the right thing. Gerald Pike was in his office when Wilson and his deputies arrived. He was reviewing council business, which was, Lily thought, either an act of tremendous composure or of genuine delusion, and she was not certain which. He looked up when they entered. He saw the badge. He saw the warrant. He saw Lily in the doorway behind the marshal, and something moved across his face that she would think about later, trying to name it. It was not fear exactly. It was recognition. The recognition of a man who has known at some level below consciousness that this moment existed somewhere in his future, and has spent 30 years hoping it was far enough away to be theoretical. It was not far enough away. Gerald Pike, Wilson said, I am placing you under arrest on the charge of murder in the death of Isaiah Stone, September 14, 1858, and on related charges of theft of intellectual property and fraud in commercial practice. You have the right to representation. Pike looked at the warrant, at the journal pages Wilson held, at his own handwriting 30 years old and as present as the morning. How he said, just a single word, I am Michael Brennan's daughter, Lily said. She was standing in the doorway, and she did not move into the room, and she did not move away from it. And I am the person you did not account for, because you never thought about what happens when the people you believed had no recourse find one. The deputies moved. Pike did not resist. He was 65 years old, and 30 years of believing himself safe had made him something less than the man who had made that calculation in a workshop on a September night, and what was left of him understood when the moment came that it was finished. Kane heard the news before Wilson reached his office. He had always been better than Pike at reading the weather of a situation, which was why he had risen from mill hand to power in 12 years while Pike had needed 30. He ran. He made it to the livery stable on the south end of town. He did not make it any further. One of Wilson's deputies had anticipated this, had positioned himself at the booth end of town before the arrest party went to Pike's office, because Wilson was the kind of man who thought 2 steps ahead and planned for the most likely alternative outcomes. Kane came out of the livery on a fast horse and found the deputy in the road with a federal badge and a drawn weapon, and the calculation he made in that moment was the most accurate calculation of his life, that the cost of the alternative was higher than the cost of stopping. He stopped. The town had gathered by then, the way that small towns gather when something significant is happening in their streets, the particular quality of public witness that communities perform when history is being made in a place that does not usually make it. They stood on the boardwalks and in the doorways and at the edges of the street, and when the deputies brought Kane back through the center of town on foot, leading his horse, the silence that accompanied that passage was its own kind of verdict. Tom Fletcher was standing outside his smithy. He began to applaud. It was not a performative gesture. He was an old man with thick hands that had worked iron for 50 years, and the sound his palms made coming together was the sound of those hands and all those years. He looked at Lily as he did it, and she understood what he was saying without him saying it. Others joined him. The woman from the general store, the nervous clerk, Horace, who had helped her find the property deeds and had been frightened every day since. Doc Cross, the men who had eaten at Kate's table and looked at their plates when Kane threatened her on her first night. One by one, and then in groups until the main street of Silverwood was producing a sound that had nothing to do with lumber prices or water rights or the grinding economics of a mountain town, a sound that was simply people recognizing that something true had happened in their presence. Jonah was beside her. He did not speak. He simply stood there, which was what she needed. She thought about her father, both of them. She thought about a young man who had died in a mine trying to do what she had done. She thought about another man who had carried his name east and built a life from it and given her everything he had, including the knowledge that good work does not care about the hands that make it. She thought it is finished. She thought it is beginning. 3 days later, in the early morning before the workshop had officially opened for the day, when the light came through the east windows in the long particular gold of autumn at altitude, and the sawdust on the floor moved in it like something alive, Jonah Stone set down the plane he had been working with and turned to face Lily Brennan across the workbench, where his father and her father had once made drawings together. "I want to say something," he said, "properly, not on a mountain with men behind us." She waited. "I have spent 3 years," he said, "understanding that the safest thing was to not want anything, to not be responsible for anything beyond what I could directly control, to not give the world another opportunity to take something from me." He looked at his hands on the workbench edge, the carpenter's hands with their scars and their competence. "You arrived in my workshop, and you were inconvenient and stubborn, and you saw things I did not want seen, and you refused to be an instrument of anyone's convenience, including mine." "That is accurate," she said. "I want to ask you to stay," he said. "One as an employee, not as an arrangement. I want to ask you to build something here with me, with Tommy, in this workshop in this town. I want to do it honestly, not through a letter and not as a transaction. Here, now, looking at you directly." He was looking at her directly. She thought about the letter that had brought her here, the forgery that Kane had written using Jonah's paper with Jonah's voice, the elaborate small cruelty that had deposited her in Silverwood with 11 cents and a split lip and no plan. She thought about how the thing that was meant to diminish her had instead delivered her to the exact place where she needed to be. "The sequence is unusual," she said. "Most people do not break into a councilman's office and ride through a mountain range before the formal courtship begins." Something happened at the corner of his mouth. "We are not most people," he said. She crossed the workshop to where he was standing. "No," she said, "we are not." 1 year later. The sign above the workshop door was new commission from a sign painter in Denver who had been given very specific instructions about the lettering and had followed them with commendable precision. Stone and Brennan Carpentry, established 1888. It was October, and the aspens on the lower slopes had gone entirely gold, the particular gold of high-altitude autumn that has no equivalent at lower elevations, too clean and too complete to be real, but stubbornly, persistently real, regardless. Inside the workshop smelled of pine and linseed oil and the particular mineral sweetness of fresh-cut hardwood, and Tommy Stone was at the workbench near the east window, learning to cut a dovetail joint under the supervision of a woman who had learned the same joint from a man she had called her father for 24 years, who had learned it himself from drawings made by two other men in this same town 30 years before. The knowledge traveled through hands. It always had. On the small altar shelf above the primary workbench, the one that Jonah had built from a piece of figured walnut, with more care than he had spent on anything in 3 years, there were three things. A photograph of Anna and Ruth Stone soft at the edges now from handling. A small brass locket on a chain open, showing the face of a young man who had died in a mine, believing that justice was too far away to be reached in his lifetime. And a piece of paper framed in simple pine on which was written in the careful hand of a man who had once been very frightened and had made the only choice available to him. Some things you cannot fight from where you are standing. You have to move before you can find the angle. Lily stood in the doorway between the workshop and the yard where the lumber was stacked, with the precision of a mind that found disorder genuinely offensive, watching the mountains to the west catch the late afternoon light in the way that mountains catch it entirely without reservation, as though they have been waiting all day for this specific quality of gold and intend to make the most of the brief time it lasts. Jonah came up beside her. His hand found hers. Below the mountains, Silverwood went about its business in the particular way of towns that have survived something difficult and have come out the other side with their essential character intact, changed, but not destroyed, which is the best outcome available to any structure, human or otherwise, when serious pressure is applied. Tom Fletcher was in his smithy. Kate Murphy was in her kitchen. Tommy was learning to cut a dovetail joint that would hold for 100 years if he got it right, and from the sounds coming from the workbench, he was going to get it right. The formula that Isaiah Stone and Michael Brennan had developed in the summer of 1858 had been ruled the intellectual property of the Stone and Brennan partnership by a federal court in Denver, with Tom Fletcher as surviving witness to the original creation. The commercial proceeds from its use over 6 years had been calculated and a portion ordered, returned. The formula was now used by Stone and Brennan Carpentry under license at a fair price for the treatment of timber that would go into buildings and bridges and structures across the territory for the next half-century. Good work. Built to last. The grain running in the right direction. Gerald Pike had been convicted of the murder of Isaiah Stone on the testimony of his own journal and the corroborating evidence of a skeleton in a mine and a letter from a dead man who had not trusted himself to fight from where he was standing, but had trusted that someone else would eventually be standing somewhere better. Vincent Kane had received 5 years for conspiracy and criminal intimidation, which was less than he deserved and more than he had expected, which was the most common outcome available to men who spend their lives calculating what they can get away with and are eventually wrong. Sheriff Bodine had resigned rather than face the federal investigation into his purchased loyalties. His replacement was a quiet man from Pueblo who had no history in Silverwood and no investments to protect. The sun reached the angle where it came through the workshop doorway in the specific way that made the sawdust move like snow and no wind at all. Lily watched it. She had arrived here with 11 cents and a forged letter and the accumulated stubbornness of a woman who has survived enough to understand that survival is not the destination, but simply the prerequisite for everything that follows. She had found her father. Both of them. She had found the truth that 30 years of power and comfort and careful documentation had not been able to keep buried because the truth has the property of all things built correctly. It does not require maintenance to hold. It simply waits. She had found a workshop that smelled like her father's workshop, which was because it had been built on the same knowledge passed through the same hands, carrying the same patient understanding of what wood is and what it can be made to become when you work with it rather than against it. She had found a man who made things that would outlast him, which is the only ambition worth having. She had found a home. The mountains held the gold for another 30 minutes, as they always did, without being asked, simply because that was their nature. Then the light changed the way it always does, the way all things do, and the workshop kept working.